The events of this opening are apparently both sad and grim. A baby has been born, but not into a happy family. Mr. Dombey, a man preoccupied apparently only with the prosperity and power of his firm, after which the novel is named, broods on the future that he's mapped out for his new son. His wife is dying, but he hardly seems to have any love for her. His daughter Florence, evidently scorned by her father, is distraught and clings to her mother as her life ebbs. It is, you might think, one of those solemn, emotion-wringing Victorian deathbed episodes. But it's also very funny. Just listen to this first chapter, and you'll hear how Dickens dares to stir comedy into the saddest narrative. In the very first sentence, the baby, who is the much-wished-for son of the firm Dombey and Son, has been put in his basket close to the fire, as if his constitution were analogous to that of a muffin, and it was essential to toast him brown while he was very new. It's the first of Dickens's many. Audacious as if he loves this turn of phrase, but the joke comparison has a point. This child, Paul Dombey, will get a parody of care from the father with whom he shares his name. Those who minister to the dying Mrs. Dombey also make you laugh just when they shouldn't. There's the nurse, who when addressed by Mr. Dombey, Mrs., is so servile as to supply her own name with a question mark block at sir, as she did not presume to state her name as a fact, but merely offered it as a mild suggestion. There is the society physician, Dr. Parker Pepys, who is so habituated to an aristocratic clientele that he keeps mistaking the name of his patient. It would appear that the system of Lady Cankerby, excuse me, I should say of Mrs. Dombey, I confused the names of cases. Poor man, he cannot get used to employers who are merely very wealthy. Even as he tries to break the news of his patient's desperate condition, he blunderingly dubs her the Countess of Dombey before correcting himself with a rapid "I beg your pardon." Mrs. Dombey in Congress comedy is Dickens's way when he's at his best. Much later in the novel, there is another inappropriately hilarious scene of getting names wrong that strikes again at Mr. Dombey's much-prized dignity. The ghastly Mrs. Scutton has successfully pimped her beautiful widowed daughter Edith to be Mr. Dombey's second wife. Now she's had a stroke and gets confused between her daughter's first husband, Colonel Granger, and her second, both of them married for money. She fell into the habit of confounding the names of her two sons-in-law, the living and the deceased. Mr. Dombey has to tolerate being called Grangeby or Domba, or indifferently. Both her name errors are like inadvertent satire. Nothing matters more to Mr. Dombey than his name. Dombey and Son has serious concerns. Above all, it is a novel about power and its abuse, but it laughs at the ways in which people take themselves seriously. The chilling Mr. Dombey presides, but he is absurd as well as life-denying. When Dickens began writing Dombey and Son in June 1846, it was with a strong interest and a strong pleasure in the ridiculous. It had been 2 years since he finished writing Martin Chuzzlewit. In the interim, he'd been traveling in Europe with his family and had published an account of his trip to Italy. He felt he had a store of invention, much of it comic, to unlock, as he told his closest friend John Foster while he was working on the second installment. Invention, thank God, seems the easiest thing in the world, and I seem to have such a preposterous sense of the ridiculous after this long rest has to be constantly requiring to restrain myself from launching into extravagances in the height of my enjoyment. Dombey and Son is full of the ridiculous and of comic redundancies, whose very existence is a kind of admonishment to Mr. Dombey. The novel is wonderful for its unnecessary comic vignettes and satirical interludes. We may be concerned about Paul Dombey's fate at Dr. Bleember's Academy in Brighton, but we get distracted by the boy's account of Glubb, the old man smelling like a weedy sea beach when the tide is out, who pulls his invalid carriage and tells very tall tales of sea creatures he has seen. We are watching the ball at Dr. Bleember's. That is Paul Dombey's touching farewell to the school, but we find ourselves listening to the know-all dancing master, Mr. Baps, who is managing to convince the self-important Sir Barnet Skettles that he is in fact an expert on foreign trade. There is also a pulsing and copious world of urban life minutely observed when we get to the premises of Dombey and Son. Dickens shows us the vendors and their bizarre wares in the court outside, even though Mr. Dombey never notices them. When Mr. Dombey, the great chief, presides in his office, he has to ignore the fact that he is overlooked by a hair-cutting saloon where a waxed head gets covered with luxuriant hair and whiskers. During the course of the day, Mr. Dombey is solemn, but the world is comic. His home is a kind of mausoleum, But the novel lets us escape into other worlds, the densely populated instrument shop of Sol Gills or Captain Cuddle's eccentrically furnished lodgings at the home of the formidable Mrs. Mustinger. There's also the railways for trains will play an important role in this novel. In the novel's second installment, Florence accompanies Polly, her brothers, wet nurse, to her home in Camden Town, where we see with Dickens's gift for the fantastic how the coming of the railways changing London here. It is all vivid chaos and incompleteness, bridges leading nowhere and buildings ready to collapse. We returned to Camden Town a few chapters and a few years later, and in a transformation Dickens must have observed firsthand himself. The railway has triumphed, everything is dedicated to it. There was even railway time observed in clocks, as if the sun itself had given in. Another of Dickens's fantastic as ifs. There are forces then more powerful than Mr. Dombey, as he will discover. In fact, this proud and wealthy man is peculiarly vulnerable, his very sense of superiority opening him to manipulation. There are men without his wealth who understand him well enough. There is his manager Kaka, with his smiling teeth and his nose for human weakness. There's the memorably horrible Major Bankstock, a monster of calculation and self-interest, who, in a kind of double bluff, announces to all who care to listen that he is hard-hearted, tough, sir, tough, and devilish sly. They are the sharks circling Mr. Dombey's apparent inhumanity is at the heart of this novel. Dickens's previous novel, Martin Chuzzlewit, had been a satire displaying the ways in which the love of money twists human nature. Dombey's son takes the theme further. Mr. Dombey is a high priest of wealth. Some have found him too stony, too unfeeling to be believed, yet Dickens was adamant that the character's very inhumanity arose from a natural human tendency. 10 years after the book's first publication, he wrote a new preface in which he described Mr. Dombey's hidden but implicit inner life. A sense of his injustice is within him all along. The more he represses it, the more unjust he necessarily is. We commonly make mistakes about people, says Dickens, by not understanding that an obstinate nature exists in a perpetual struggle with itself. Dombey's Son, written in his mid-30s, when he already had 7 novels behind him, was in many ways a new departure for Dickens. It's a novel of great technical ingenuity and daring. Listen for the extraordinary shifts into the present tense to dramatize key episodes. It was the first English novel to divide up the narrative between past and present tenses, a technique Dickens would perfect in Bleak House. In chapter 14 of the novel, he attempted something that he clearly thought had never been attempted before in fiction: the representation of the world entirely through the consciousness of a child. The 6-year-old Paul Dombey, knowing yet innocent as he is, Paul is sometimes puzzled by the behavior of others towards him. Dickens's narration lets us experience his puzzlement, but also infer what the child cannot understand. This is something very different from the intense recollection of childhood by a first-person adult narrator that you get in his 2 later novels, David Copperfield and Great Expectations. Dombey's Son was also perhaps the first of his novels to be closely planned with a sense from the first of what is to come. In this introduction, I must be careful not to give away the plot, yet first-time readers or listeners will find themselves constantly guessing shrewdly at what is to come. This is because Dickens wanted us to foresee events. The first readers of the novel, of course, were consuming it in monthly installments of 3 or 4 chapters at a time. The novel initially appeared in 20 monthly parts between October 1846 and April 1848. Its readers kept having to wait for the next part, speculating about what might be to come. Dickens planned carefully. We know this because the number of plans for Dombey and Son have survived. It might be the first of his novels for which he made these plans. They are full of indications as to future events. In fact, Dickens inserts into his narrative warnings about where the story is leading. In the very first installment of the novel, he has introduced us to Paul Dombey's wet nurse, Polly, who has comforted the neglected Florence. She is short on artificial accomplishments, but natural in her affections, and perhaps unlearned as she was, she could have brought a dawning knowledge home to Mr. Dombey at that early day, which would not then have struck him in the end like lightning, as if to draw attention to this curious narrative slippage into the future. Dickens adds, but this is from the purpose. Readers have to get used to the fact that Dickens is often there in his narrative, foreseeing and predicting, exclaiming at his characters as if he found them rather than invented them. Here he is describing Mr. Dombey's rooms on the day of his son's christening. They were black, cold rooms, and seemed to be in mourning like the inmates of the house. Is there another great novelist who would cry eek at what he sees in his own novel? Dickens will exclaim more than once at Mr. Dombey's unconsciousness of what is to come. Awake, unkind father, awake now, sullen man, the hour is coming with an angry tread. Awake. We should remember that Dickens wrote to be read aloud. Accounts of his habits of composition recall that he often performed what he was writing. As he was writing it, he knew that his novels would often be read aloud in Victorian homes, and later in his career, he made a huge success of his own public readings of famous passages, including some from Danielson. His interest in the sound and rhythm of what he wrote is there in his wonderful invention of singular ways of speaking for all his characters. Listen to them, all those different voices, for nothing is more wonderful, and often nothing is funnier. Chapter 1. Dobby and Son. Dobby sat in the corner of the darkened room, in the great armchair by the bedside, and Son lay tucked up warm, in a little basket bedstead carefully disposed on a low settee immediately in front of the fire, and close to it, as if his constitution were analogous to that of a muffin, and it was essential to toast him brown while he was very new. Dombey was about 48 years of age. Son about 48 . Dombey was rather bald, rather red, and though a handsome, well-made man, too stern and pompous in appearance to be prepossessing, Son was very bald and very red, and though of course an undeniably fine infant, somewhat crushed and spotty in his general effect, as yet on the brow of Dombey time and his brother Care had set some marks, as on a tree that was to come down in good time. Remorseless twins they are for striding through their human forests, notching as they go, while the countenance of Son was crossed with 1,000 little creases which the same deceitful time would take delight in smoothing out, and wearing away with the flat part of his scythe as a preparation of the surface for his deeper operations. Dombey, exulting in the long-looked-for event, jingled and jingled the heavy gold watch chain that depended from below his trim blue coat, whereof the buttons sparkled phosphorescently in the feeble rays of the distant fire. Son, with his little fists curled up and clenched, seemed in his feeble way to be squaring at existence for having come upon him so unexpectedly. The house will once again. Mrs. Dobby said Mr. Dobby be not only in name, but in fact Dobby and Son, and he added in a tone of luxurious satisfaction, with his eyes half closed as if he were reading the name in a device of flowers and inhaling their fragrance. At the same time, Dombey Anson, the words had such a softening influence that he appended a term of endearment to Mrs. Dombey's name, though not without some hesitation, as being a man but little used to that form of address, and said Mrs. Dombey, my dear. A transient flush of faint surprise overspread the sick lady's face as she raised her eyes towards him. He will be christened Paul, my Mrs. Stumpy. Of course, she feebly echoed of course, or rather expressed it by the motion of her lips, and closed her eyes again. His father's name Mrs. Dobby, and his grandfather's. I wish his grandfather were alive this day. There is some inconvenience in the necessity of writing Junior, said Mr. Dobby, making a fictitious autograph on his knee, but it is merely of a private and personal complexion. It doesn't enter into correspondence of the house. Its signature remains the same. And again he said Dombey and Son in exactly the same tone as before. Those three words conveyed the one idea of Mr. Dobby's life. The earth was made for Dobby and Son to trade in, and the sun and moon were made to give them light. Rivers and seas were formed to float their ships. Rainbows gave them promise of fair weather. Winds blew for or against their enterprises. Stars and planets circled in their orbits to preserve and violate a system of which they were the center. Common abbreviations took new meanings in his eyes and had so reference to them. AD had no concern with Anno Domini, but stood for Anno Domini, and Son. He had risen as his father had before him in the course of life and death from son to Dond, and for nearly 20 years had been the sole representative of the firm of those years. He had been married as some said, to a lady with no heart to give him, whose happiness was in the past, and who was content to bind her broken spirit to the dutiful and meek endurance of the present. Such idle talk was little likely to reach the ears of Mr. Dobby, whom it nearly concerned, and probably no one in the world would have received it with such utter incredulity as he if it had reached him. Dobby and Son had often dealt in hides, but never in hearts. They left that fanciful where to boys and girls and boarding schools and books. Mr. Dombey would have reasoned that a matrimonial alliance with himself must in the nature of things be gratifying and honorable to any woman of common sense, that the hope of giving birth to a new partner in such a house could not fail to awaken a glorious and stirring ambition in the breast of the least ambitious of her sex, that Mrs. Dombey had entered on that social contract of matrimony, almost necessarily part of a genteel and wealthy station, even without reference to the perpetuation of family firms, with her eyes fully open to these advantages, that Mrs. Dombey had had daily practical knowledge of his position in society, that Mrs. Dombey had always sat at the head of his table and done the honors of his house in a remarkably ladylike and becoming manner, that Mrs. Dombey must have been happy, that she couldn't help it all at all events, with one drawback, yes, that he would have allowed with only one, but that one certainly involving much with the drawback of hope deferred, that hope deferred which, as the scripture very correctly tells us, Mr. Dombey would have added in a patronizing way for his highest distinct idea, even of scripture, if examined, would have been found to be that as forming part of a general whole, of which Dombey and Son formed another part, it was therefore to be commended and upheld, maketh the heart sick. They had been married 10 years, and until this present day on which Mr. Dombey sat jingling his heavy gold watch chain in the great armchair by the side of the bed, had had no issue to speak of, none worth mentioning. There had been a girl some 6 years before, and the child who had stolen into the chamber unobserved was now crouching timidly in a corner when she could see her mother's face. But what was a girl to Dombey and Son and the capital of the house's name and dignity? Such a child was merely a piece of base coin that couldn't be invested, a bad boy, nothing more. Mr. Dombey's cup of satisfaction was so full at this moment, however, that he felt he could afford a drop or two of its contents, even to sprinkle on the dust in the bypath of his little daughter. So he said, "Florence, you may go and look at your pretty brother if you like. I dare say don't touch him." The child glanced keenly at the blue coat and stiff white cravat, which with a pair of creaking boots and a very loud ticking watch embodied her idea of a father, but her eyes returned to her mother's face immediately, and she neither moved nor answered her insensibility, as is proof against her brother as against everything else, said Mr. Dombey to himself. He seemed so confirmed in a previous opinion by the discovery as to be quite glad of it. Next moment the lady had opened her eyes and seen the child, and the child had run towards her, and standing on tiptoe the better to hide her face in her embrace, had clung about her with a desperate affection very much at variance with her years. "Oh Lord bless me," said Mr. Dombey, rising testily, a very ill-advised and feverish proceeding this. "I'm sure pleased to ring there from Miss Florence's nurse. Really, the person should be more careful. Wait, I had better ask Dr. Peps if he'll have the goodness to step upstairs again. Perhaps I'll go down. I needn't beg you," he added, pausing for a moment at the settee before the fire, "to take particular care of this young gentleman." "Mrs. Blockett, sir," suggested the nurse, a simpering piece of faded gentility, who did not presume to state her name as a fact, but merely offered it as a mild suggestion of this young gentleman. Mrs. Blockett: "No, sir, indeed, I remember when Miss Florence was born," said Mr. Dombey, bending over the basket bedstead and slightly bending his brows at the same time. "Miss Florence was all very well, but this is another matter. This young gentleman has to accomplish a destiny. Little fellow," as he thus apostrophized, "is the infant." He raised one of his hands to his lips and kissed it, then, seeming to fear that the action involved some compromise of his dignity, went awkwardly enough away. Dr. Parker Peps, one of the court physicians, and a man of immense reputation for assisting at the increase of great families, was walking up and down the drawing room with his hands behind him, to the unspeakable admiration of the family surgeon, who had regularly puffed the case for the last 6 weeks among all of his patients' friends and acquaintances as one to which he was in hourly expectation, day and night, of being summoned in conjunction with Dr. Parker Peps. "Well, sir," said Dr. Parker Peps in a round, deep, sonorous voice, muffled for the occasion like the knocker, "do you find that your dear lady is at all roused by your visit, stimulated, as it were," said the family practitioner, faintly bowing at the same time to the doctor, as much to say, "Excuse my putting in a word, but this is a valuable connection." Mr. Dombey was quite discomforted by the question. He had thought so little of the patient that he was not in a condition to answer it. He said that it would be a satisfaction to him if Dr. Parker Peps would walk upstairs again, "Good, we must not disguise from you, sir," said Dr. Parker Peps, "that there is a warrant of power in her grace the Duchess. I beg your pardon. I confound names. I should say in your amiable lady that there is a certain degree of languor and a general absence of elasticity, which we would rather not see," interposed the family practitioner, with another inclination of the head. "Quite so," said Dr. Parker Peps, "which we would rather not see. It would appear that the system of Lady Cankerby, oh, excuse me, I should say of Mrs. Dunbury, I confuse the names of cases so very numerous," murmured the family practitioner. "Can't be expected. I'm sure quite wonderful, if otherwise." Dr. Parker Pepsi's West End practice. "Thank you," said the doctor. "Quite so. It would appear I was observing that the system of our patient has sustained a shock from which it can only hope to rally by a great and strong and vigorous," murmured the family practitioner. "Quite so," assented the doctor, "and vigorous effort. Mr. Pilkins here, who from his position of medical advisor in this family, no one better qualified to fill that position, I'm sure," oh, murmured the family practitioner. "Praise from Sir Hubert Stanley. You are good enough," returned Dr. Parker Peps, "to say so. Mr. Pilkins, who from his position is best acquainted with the patient's constitution in its normal state, an acquaintance very valuable to us in forming our opinions in these occasions, is of opinion with me that nature must be called upon to make a vigorous effort in this instance, and that if our interesting friend the Countess of Dombey, I beg your pardon, Mrs. Dombey, should not be able," said the family practitioner, "to make," said Dr. Parker Peps, "that effort," said the family practitioner. "Successfully," said they both together. Then added Dr. Parker Peps, "alone and very gravely a crisis might arise, which we should both sincerely deplore, with that they stood for a few seconds looking at the ground, then on the motion made in dumb show of Dr. Parker Peps, they went upstairs, the family practitioner opening the room door for that distinguished professional and following him out with most obsequious politeness. To record of Mr. Dobby that he was not in his way affected by this intelligence would be to do him an injustice. He was not a man of whom it could properly be said that he was ever startled or shocked, but he certainly had a sense within him that if his wife should sicken and decay he would be very sorry, and that he would find us something gone from among his plate and furniture and other household possessions, which was well worth the having and could not be lost without sincere regret, though it would be a cool business, like gentlemanly self-possessed regret. No doubt his meditations on the subject was soon interrupted, first by the rustling of garments on the staircase, and then by the sudden whisking into the room of a lady rather past the middle age than otherwise, but dressed in a very juvenile manner, particularly as to the tightness of her bodice, who, running up to him with a kind of screw in her face and carriage expressive of suppressed emotion, flung her arms around his neck and said in a choking voice, "My dear Paul, he's quite a dandy." Well, well, returned her brother, for Mr. Dombey was her brother. "I think he is like the family." "Don't agitate yourself, Louisa. It's very foolish of me," said Louisa, sitting down and taking out her pocket handkerchief. "But is he such a perfect Dobby?" Mr. Dobby coughed. "It's so extraordinary," said Louisa, smiling through her tears, which indeed were not overpowering, "as to be perfectly ridiculous so completely. Our family, I never saw anything like it in my life. But what is this about Fanny herself?" said Mr. Dobby. "How is Fanny, my dear Paul?" returned Louisa. "It's nothing whatever, take my word. It's nothing whatever. There is exhaustion, certainly, but nothing like what I underwent myself either with George or Frederick. An effort is necessary, that's all. If dear Fanny were a Dombey. But I dare say she make it. I have no doubt she make it, knowing it to be required of her as a duty. Of course she make it, my dear Paul. It's very weak and silly of me, I know, to be so trembly and shaky from head to foot, but I'm so very queer that I must ask you for a glass of wine and a morsel of that cake." Mr. Dombey promptly supplied her with these refreshments from a tray on the table. "I shall not drink my love to you, Paul," said Louisa. "I shall drink to the little Dobby. Good gracious me, it's the most astonishing thing I ever knew in all my days. He's such a perfect Dobby." Quenching this expression of opinion in a short hysterical laugh, which terminated in tears, Louisa cast up her eyes and emptied her glass. "I know it's very weak and silly of me, as you repeated, to be so trembly and shaky from head to foot, and to allow my feelings so completely to get the better of me. But I cannot help it. I thought I should have fallen out of the staircase window as I came down from seeing dear Fanny, and that tiddy little thing These last words originated in a sudden vivid reminiscence of the baby. They were succeeded by a gentle tap at the door. Mrs. Chick said, a very bland female voice outside. "How are you now, my dear friend, my dear Paul?" said Louisa in a low voice as she rose from her seat. "It's Miss Tokes, the kindest creature I never could have got here without her. Miss Tokes, my brother, Mr. Dombey. Paul, my dear, my very particular friend, Miss Tokes." The lady thus specially presented was a long, lean figure wearing such a faded air that she seemed not to have been made in what linen drapers call fast colors originally, and to have by little and little washed out. But for this she might have been described as the very pink of general propitiation and politeness from a long habit of listening admiringly to everything that was said in her presence, and looking at the speakers as if she were mentally engaged in taking off impressions of their images upon her soul, never depart with the same. But with life her head had quite settled on one side, her hands had contracted a spasmodic habit of raising themselves of their own accord as in involuntary admiration. Her eyes were liable to a similar affection. She had the softest voice that was ever heard, and her nose, stupendously aquiline, had a little knob in the very center or keystone of the bridge, whence it tended downwards towards her face as in an invincible determination never to turn up at anything. Miss Tokes's dress, though perfectly genteel and good, had a certain character of angularity and scantiness. She was accustomed to wear odd weedy little flowers in her bonnets and caps. Strange grasses were sometimes perceived in her hair, and it was observed by the curious of all her collars, frills, tuckers, wristbands, and other gossamer articles, indeed of everything she wore, which had two ends to it intended to unite, that the two ends were never on good terms and wouldn't quite meet without a struggle. She had furry articles for winter wear, as tippets, bowers, and muffs, which stood up on end in rampant manner and were not at all sleek. She was much given to the carrying about of small bags with snaps to them that went off like little pistols when they were shut up, and when full dressed she wore around her neck the most barbarous of lockets, representing a fishy old eye with no approach to speculation in it. These and other appearances of a similar nature had served to propagate the opinion that Miss Tokes was a lady of what is called a limited independence, which she turned to the best account. Possibly her mincing gait encouraged the belief, and suggested that her clipping a step of ordinary compass into 2 or 3 originated in her habit of making the most of everything. "I am sure," said Miss Tokes with a prodigious curtsy, "that to have the honor of being presented to Mr. Dombey is a distinction which I have long sought, but very little expected at the present moment. My dear Mrs. Chick, may I say Louisa?" Mrs. Chick took Miss Tokes's hand in hers, rested the foot of her wine glass upon it, repressed a tear, and said in a low voice, "God bless you, my dear Louisa." Then said Miss Tokes, "My sweet friend, how are you now?" "Better," Miss Chick returned. "Take some wine. You have been almost as anxious as I have been, and you must want it, I'm sure." Mr. Dombey of course officiated, and also refilled his sister's glass, which she, looking another way and unconscious of his intention, held straight and steady the while, and then regarded with great astonishment, saying, "My dear Paul, what have you been doing?" "Miss Tokes," Paul pursued Mrs. Cricks, still retaining her hand, "and knowing how much I have been interested in the anticipation of the event of today, and how trembly and shaky I have been from head to foot in expectation of it, has been working at a little gift for Fanny, which I promised to present." Miss Tokes's ingenuity itself. "My dear Louisa," said Miss Tokes, "don't say so. It is only a pin cushion for the toilet table." Paul resumed his sister, "One of those trifles which are insignificant to your sex in general, as it's very natural they should be. We have no business to expect they should be otherwise, but to which we attach some interest." "Miss Tokes is very good," said Mr. Dombey, "and I do say, and will say, and must say," pursued his sister, pressing the foot of the wine glass on Miss Tokes's hand at each of the 3 clauses, "that Miss Tokes has very prettily adapted the sentiment to the occasion. I call welcome little Dombey poetry myself." "Is that the device?" inquired her brother. "That is the device," returned Louisa. "But do me the justice to remember, my dear Louisa," said Miss Tokes, in a tone of low and earnest entreaty, "that nothing but I have some difficulty in expressing myself. The dubiousness of the result would have induced me to take so great a liberty. Welcome, Master Dombey, would have been much more congenial to my feelings, as I'm sure you know, but the uncertainty attendant on angelic Strangers will, I hope, excuse what must otherwise appear an unwarrantable familiarity. Miss Tokes made a graceful bend as she spoke in favor of Mr. Dobby, which that gentleman graciously acknowledged even the sort of recognition of Dambian. Son conveyed in the foregoing conversation was so palatable to him that his sister Mrs. Chick, though he affected to consider her a weak, good-natured person, had perhaps more influence over him than anybody else. My dear Paul, that lady broke out afresh after silently contemplating his features for a few moments. I don't know whether to laugh or cry when I look at you. I declare you do so. Remind me of that dear baby upstairs. Well, said Mrs. Chick with a sweet smile. After this I forgive Fanny everything. It was a declaration in a Christian spirit, and Mrs. Chick felt that it did her good, not that she had anything particular to forgive in her sister-in-law, nor indeed anything at all except her having married her brother in itself a species of audacity, and her having in the course of events given birth to a girl instead of a boy, which, as Mrs. Chick had frequently observed, was not quite what she had expected of her, and was not a pleasant return for all the attention and distinction she had met with. Mr. Dombey being hastily summoned out of the room at this moment, the two ladies were left alone together. Miss Tokes immediately became spasmodic. I knew you would admire my brother. I told you so beforehand. My dear, said Louisa. Miss Tokes's hands and eyes expressed how much. And as to his property, my dear, said Miss Tokes with a deep feeling immense. But his deportment, my dear Louisa, said Miss Tokes, his presence, his dignity, no portrait that I have ever seen of anyone has been half so replete with those qualities, something so stately, you know, so uncompromising, so very wide across the chest, so upright, a pecuniary Duke of York, my love, and nothing short of it, said Miss Tokes. That's what I should designate him. Why, my dear Paul, exclaimed his sister as he returned, you look quite pale. There's nothing the matter, I am sorry to say, Louisa, that they tell me that Fanny. Now, my dear Ball, returned his sister, rising, don't believe it. Do not allow yourself to receive a turn unnecessarily. Remember of what importance you are to society, and do not allow yourself to be worried by what is so very inconsiderately told you by people who ought to know better. Really, I'm surprised at them. I hope I know, Louisa, said Mr. Dombey stiffly, how to bear myself before the world. Nobody better, my dear, poor nobody half so well. They would be ignorant and base indeed who doubted it. Ignorant and base indeed, echoed Miss Tokes softly. But, pursued Louisa, if you have any reliance on my experience, Paul, you may rest assured that there is nothing wanting but an effort on Fanny's part. And that effort, she continued, taking off her bonnet and adjusting her cap and gloves in a businesslike manner, she must be encouraged, and rarely, if necessary, urged to make. Now, my dear Paul, come upstairs with me. Mr. Dombey, who besides being generally influenced by his sister for the reason already mentioned, had really faith in her as an experienced and bustling matron, acquiesced and followed her at once to the sick chamber. The lady lay upon her bed as he had left her, clasping her little daughter to her breast. The child clung close about her with the same intensity as before, and never raised her head or moved her soft cheek from her mother's face, or looked on those who stood around, or spoke or moved, or shed a tear. Restless without the little girl, the doctor whispered, Mr. Dombey, we found it best to have her in again. Can nothing be done? Asked Mr. Dombey. The doctor shook his head. We can do no more. The windows stood open, and the twilight was gathering. Without the scent of the restoratives that had been tried was pungent in the room, but had no fragrance in the dull and languid air the lady breathed. There was such a solemn stillness round the bed, and the two medical attendants seemed to look on the impassive form with so much compassion and so little hope that Mrs. Chick was for the moment diverted from her purpose. But presently, summoning courage and what she called presence of mind, she sat down by the bedside and said in the low, precise tone of one who endeavors to awaken a sleeper, Fanny, Fanny. There was no sound in answer but the loud ticking of Mr. Dombey's watch and Dr. Parker Peps's watch, which seemed in the silence to be running a race. Fanny, my dear, said Mrs. Chick with assumed lightness, here's Mr. Dombey come to see you. Won't you speak to him? They want to lay your little boy, the baby, Fanny. You know, you've hardly seen him yet, I think, in bed. But they can't till you rouse yourself a little. Don't you think it's time you roused yourself a little, eh? She bent her ear to the bed and listened at the same time, looking round at the bystanders and holding up her finger. She repeated, what was it you said, Fanny? I didn't hear you. No word, or sound and answer. Mr. Dobby's watch and Dr. Parker Peps's watch seemed to be racing faster now. Really, Fanny, my dear, said the sister-in-law, altering her position and speaking less confidently and more earnestly in spite of herself. I shall have to be quite cross with you if you don't rise yourself. It's necessary for you to make an effort, and perhaps a very great and painful effort which you are not disposed to make. But this is a world of effort, you know, Fanny, and we must never yield when so much depends upon us. Come, try. I must really scold you if you don't. The race in the ensuing pause was fierce and furious. The watchers seemed to jostle and to trip each other up. Fanny, said Louisa, glancing round with a gathering alarm, only look at me, only open your eyes to show me that you hear and understand me. Will you? Good heaven, gentlemen, what is to be done? The two medical attendants exchanged a look across the bed, and the physician, stooping down, whispered in the child's ear. Not having understood the purport of his whisper, the little creature turned a perfectly colorless face and deep dark eyes towards him, but without loosening her hold in the least. The whisper was repeated. Mama, said the child, the little voice, familiar and dearly loved, awakened some show of consciousness even at the ebb. For a moment the closed eyelids trembled and the nostril quivered, and the faintest shadow of a smile was seen. Mama, cried the child, sobbing aloud. Oh dear Mama, oh dear Mama. The doctor gently brushed the scattered ringlets of the child aside from the face and mouth of the mother. Alas, how calm they lay there, how little breath there was to stir them, thus clinging fast to that slight spar within her arms. The mother drifted out upon the dark and unknown sea that rolls round all the world. Chapter 2, in which timely provision is made for an emergency that will sometimes arise in the best regulated families. I shall never cease to congratulate myself, said Mrs. Chick, on having said, when I little thought what was in store for us, really, as if I was inspired by something, that I forgave poor dear Fanny everything whatever happens. That must always be a comfort to me. Mrs. Chick made this impressive observation in the drawing room after having descended thither from the inspection of the mantua makers upstairs, who were busy on the family mourning. She delivered it for the behoof of Mr. Chick, who was a stout, bald gentleman with a very large face and his hands continually in his pockets, and who had a tendency in his nature to whistle and hum tunes which, sensible of the indecorum of such sounds in a house of grief, he was at some pains to repress at present. Don't you overexert yourself, Lou, said Mr. Chick, or you'll be laid up with spasms. I see. Total, bless my soul, I forgot we're here one day and gone the next. Mrs. Chick contented herself with a glance of reproof, and then proceeded with the thread of her discourse. I'm sure, she said, I hope this heart-rending occurrence will be a warning to all of us to accustom ourselves to rouse ourselves and to make efforts in time where they're required of us. There's a moral in everything. If we would only avail ourselves of it, it will be our own faults if we lose sight of this one. Mr. Chick invaded the grave silence which ensued on this remark with the singularly inappropriate air of a cobbler there was, and checking himself in some confusion, observed that it was undoubtedly our own fault if we didn't improve such melancholy occasions as the present, which might be better improved, I should think, Mr. C, retorted his helpmate, after a short pause, then by the introduction either of the college hornpipe or the equally unmeaning and unfeeling remark of rumpety-iddity-bow-wow-wow, which Mr. Chick had indeed indulged in under his breath, and which Mrs. Chick repeated in a tone of withering scorn. Merely habit, my dear, kidded Mr. Chick. Nonsense, habit, returned his wife. If you're a rational being, don't make such ridiculous excuses. Habit, if I was to get a habit, as you call it, of walking on the ceiling like the flies, I should hear enough of it. I dare say it appeared so probable that such a habit might be attended with some degree of notoriety that Mr. Chick didn't venture to dispute the position. Bow wow wow, repeated Mrs. Chick with an emphasis of blighting contempt on the last syllable, more like a professional singer with a hydrophobia than a man in your station of life. How's the baby, Lou, asked Mr. Chick. To change the subject, what baby do you mean, answered Mrs. Chick. The poor bereaved little baby, said Mr. Chick. I don't know of any other, my dear. You don't know of any other, retorted Mrs. Chick. More shame for you. I was going to say. Mr. Chick looked astonished. I'm sure the morning I have had with that dining room downstairs, one mass of babies, no one in their senses would believe one mass of babies, repeated Mr. Chick, staring with an alarmed expression about him. It would have Occurred to both men, said Mrs. Chick, that poor dear Fanny being no more those words of mine, will always be a balm and comfort to me. Here she dried her eyes. It becomes necessary to provide a nurso, said Mr. Chick, to ruin such as life. I mean, I hope you are suited, my dear. Indeed, I'm not, said Mrs. Chick, nor likely to be so far as I can see. And in the meantime, the poor child seems likely to be starved to death. Paul is so very particular naturally, so of course having set his whole heart on this one boy, and there are so many objections to everybody that offers that I don't see myself the least chance of an arrangement. Meanwhile, of course, the child is going to the devil, said Mr. Chick thoughtfully, to be sure admonished, however, that he had committed himself by the indignation expressed in Mrs. Chick's countenance at the idea of a Dombey going there, and thinking to atone for his misconduct by a bright suggestion, he added, couldn't something temporary be done with the teapot if he had meant to bring the subject prematurely to a close? He could not have done it more effectually. After looking at him for some moments in silent resignation, Mrs. Chick said she trusted he hadn't said it in aggravation, because that would do very little honor to his heart. She trusted he hadn't said it seriously, because that would do very little honor to his head, as in any case he couldn't, however sanguinely his disposition, hope to offer a remark that would be a greater outrage on human nature in general. She would beg to leave the discussion. At that point, Mrs. Chick then walked majestically to the window and peeped through the blind, attracted by the sound of wheels. Mr. Chick, finding that his destiny was for the time against him, said no more and walked off. But it was not always thus with Mr. Chick. He was often in the ascendant himself, and at those times punished Louisa roundly in their matrimonial bickerings. They were upon the whole a well-matched, fairly balanced give and take couple. It would have been, generally speaking, very difficult to have betted on the winner. Often, when Mr. Chick seemed beaten, he would suddenly make a start, turn the tables, clatter them about the ears of Mrs. Chick, and carry all before him, being liable himself to similar unlooked-for checks from Mrs. Chick. Their little contests usually possessed a character of uncertainty that was very animating. Miss Stocks had arrived on the wheels just now alluded to, and came running into the room in a breathless condition. My dear Louisa, said Miss Stocks, is the vacancy still unsupplied, you good soul? Yes, said Mrs. Chick. Then, my dear Louisa, returned Miss Stokes, I hope and believe, but in one moment. My dear, I'll introduce the party. Running downstairs again as fast as she had run up, Miss Stocks got the party out of the hackney coach and soon returned with it under convoy. It then appeared that she had used the word not in its legal or business acceptance, when it merely expresses an individual, but as a noun of multitude or signifying many. For Miss Stokes escorted a plump, rosy-cheeked, wholesome, apple-faced young woman with an infant in her arms, a younger woman not so plump but apple-faced also, who led a plump and apple-faced child in each hand, another plump and also apple-faced boy who walked by himself, and finally a plump and apple-faced man who carried in his arms another plump and apple-faced boy, whom he stood down on the floor and admonished in a husky whisper to catch hold of his brother Johnny. My dear Louisa, said Miss Stokes, knowing your great anxiety and wishing to relieve it, I posted off myself to the Queen Charlotte's Royal Married Females, which you had forgot, and put the question, was there anybody there that they thought would suit? No, they said there was not. When they gave me that answer, I do assure you, my dear, I was almost driven to despair on your account. But it did so happen that one of the Royal Married Females, hearing the inquiry, reminded the matron of another who had gone to her own home, and who she said would in all likelihood be most satisfactory. The moment I heard this, and had it corroborated by the matron, excellent references, an unimpeachable character, I got the address, my dear, and posted off again. Let the good dear Stokes, you are, said Louisa. Not at all, returned Miss Stokes. Don't say so. Arriving at the house, the cleanest place, my dear, you might eat your dinner off the floor. I found the whole family sitting at table, and feeling that no account of them could be half so comfortable to you and Mr. Dombey as the sight of them all together, I brought them all away. This gentleman, said Miss Stokes, pointing out the apple-faced man, is the father. Will you have the goodness to come a little forwards? To the apple-faced man, having sheepishly complied with this request, stood chuckling and grinning in a front row. This is his wife, of course, said Miss Stokes, singling out the young woman with the baby. How do you do, Polly? I'm pretty well, I thank you, ma'am, said Polly, by way of bringing her out dexterously. Miss Stokes had made the inquiry as in condescension. to an old acquaintance, whom she hadn't seen for a fortnight or so. "I'm glad to hear it," said Miss Tokes. "The other young woman is our unmarried sister who lives with them and would take care of her children. Her name is Jemima." "How do you do, Jemima?" "I'm pretty well, I thank you, ma'am," returned Jemima. "I'm very glad indeed to hear it," said Miss Tokes. "I hope you'll keep so." 5 children, youngest 6 weeks. The fine little boy with the blister on his nose is the eldest. "The blister, I believe," said Miss Tokes, looking round upon the family, "is not constitutional, but accidental." The apple-faced man was understood to growl. "Flatiron." "I beg your pardon, sir," said Miss Tokes. "Did you flatiron?" he repeated. "Oh yes," said Miss Tokes. "Yes, quite true. I forgot the little creature in his mother's absence. Smelled a warm flat iron." "You're quite right, sir. You were going to have the goodness to inform me, when we arrived at the door, that you were by trade a still stoker," said the man. "A choker," said Miss Tokes, quite aghast. "Stoker," said the man. "Steam engine." "Oh yes," returned Miss Tokes, looking thoughtfully at him and seeming still to have but a very imperfect understanding of his meaning. "And how do you like it, sir?" "Which, mum?" said the man. "That," replied Miss Toggs. "Your trade?" "Oh, pretty well, ma'am. The ashes of Dobbs get in here," touching his chest, "and makes a man speak cough as at the present time. But it is ashes, ma'am, not crustiness." Miss Tokes seemed to be so little enlightened by this reply as to find a difficulty in pursuing the subject, but Mrs. Check relieved her by entering into a close private examination of Polly, her children, her marriage certificate, testimonials, and so forth. Polly coming out unscathed from this ordeal, Mrs. Chick withdrew with her report to her brother's room, and as an emphatic comment on it and corroboration of it carried the 2 rosest little Toodles, with her Toodle being the family name of the apple-faced family. Mr. Dombey had remained in his own apartment since the death of his wife, absorbed in visions of the youth, education, and destination of his baby son. Something lay at the bottom of his cool heart, colder and heavier than its ordinary load, but it was more a sense of the child's loss than his own awakening within him, an almost angry sorrow that the life and progress on which he built such hopes should be endangered in the outset by so mean a want. The Dambian son should be tottering for a nurse was a sore humiliation, and yet in his pride and jealousy he viewed with so much bitterness the thought of being dependent for the very first step towards the accomplishment of his soul's desire on a hired serving woman who would be to the child for the time all that even his alliance could have made his own wife, that in every new rejection of a candidate he felt a secret pleasure. The time had now come, however, when he could no longer be divided between these 2 sets of feelings, the less so as there seemed to be no flaw in the title of Polly Toodle. After his sister had set it forth with many commendations on the indefatigable friendship of Miss Tokes. "These children look healthy," said Mr. Dombey, "but my God, to think of their some day claiming a sort of relationship to Paul." "But what relationship is there?" Louisa began. "Is there?" echoed Mr. Dombey, who had not intended his sister to participate in the thought he had unconsciously expressed. "Is there, did you say, Louisa? Can there be?" "I mean, why none," said Mr. Dombey sternly. "The whole world knows that. I presume grief has not made me idiotic." "Louisa, take them away." "Louisa, let me see this woman." And her husband, Mrs. Chick, bore off the tender pair of Toodles and presently returned with that tougher couple whose presence her brother had commanded. "My good woman," said Mr. Dombey, turning round in his easy chair as one piece, and not as a man with limbs and joints, "I understand you are poor and wish to earn money by nursing the little boy, my son, who has been so prematurely deprived of what can never be replaced. I have no objection to your adding to the comforts of your family. By that means, so far as I can tell, you seem to be a deserving object. But I must impose 1 or 2 conditions on you before you enter my house. In that capacity, while you are here, I must stipulate that you are always known as, say, as Richards, an ordinary name and convenient. Have you any objection to being known as Richards?" "You had better consult your husband." "Well," said Mr. Dombey after a pretty long pause, "what does your husband say to you being called Richards?" As the husband did nothing but chuckle and grin and continually draw his right hand across his mouth, moistening the palm, Mrs. Toodle, after nudging him twice or thrice, in vain dropped to curtsy and replied that perhaps if she was to be called out of her name, it would be considered in the wages. "Oh, of course," said Mr. Dombey, "I desire to make it a question of wages altogether. Now, Richards, if you nurse my bereaved Child, I wish you to remember this always. You will receive a liberal stipend in return for the discharge of certain duties, in the performance of which I wish you to see as little of your family as possible when those duties cease to be required and rendered, and the stipend ceases to be paid. There's an end of all relations between us. Do you understand me?" Mrs. Tootle seemed doubtful about it. And as to Tootle himself, he had evidently no doubt whatever that he was all abroad. "You have children of your own," said Mr. Dumby. "It is not at all in this bargain that you need become attached to my child, or that my child need become attached to you. I don't expect or desire anything of the kind, quite the reverse. When you go away from here, you will have concluded what is a mere matter of bargain and sale, hiring and letting, and will stay away. The child will cease to remember you, and you will cease, if you please, to remember the child." Mrs. Tootle, with a little more color in her cheeks than she had had before, said she hoped she knew her place. "I hope you do, Richards," said Mr. Dombey. "I have no doubt you know it very well. Indeed, it is so plain and obvious that it could hardly be otherwise. Louisa, my dear, arrange with Richards about money, and let her have it when and how she pleases. Mr. What's your name? I'll wait with you, if you please." Thus arrested on the threshold, as he was following his wife out of the room, Tootle returned and confronted Mr. Dombey alone. He was a strong, loose, round-shouldered, shuffling, shaggy fellow on whom his clothes sat negligently, with a good deal of hair and a whisker deepened in its natural tint, perhaps by smoke and coal dust, hard, knotty hands, and a square forehead as coarse in grain as the bark of an oak, a contrast in all respects to Mr. Dombey, who was one of those close-shaved, close-cut, moneyed gentlemen who are glossy and crisp like new bank notes, and who seem to be artificially braced and tightened as by the stimulating action of golden shower baths. "You have a son, I believe," said Mr. Dunbowie. "For on sir, for him's and all alive. Why, it's as much as you can afford to keep them," said Mr. Dombey. "I couldn't hardly afford but one thing in the world less, sir." "What is that to lose, sir? Can you read?" asked Mr. Dombey. "Why not particularly, sir. Write with chalk, sir. With anything I could make shift to chalk a little bit, I think, if I was put to it," said Tootle, after some reflection. "And yet," said Mr. Dombey, "you are 2 or 3 and 30, I suppose." "Day about, I suppose, sir," answered Tootle, after more reflection. "Then why don't you learn?" asked Mr. Dombey. "So I'm a-going to, sir. One of my little boys is a-going to learn me when he's old enough, and beat the school himself well," said Mr. Dombey, after looking at him attentively, and with no great favor, as he stood gazing round the room, principally round the ceiling, and still drawing his hand across and across his mouth. "You heard what I said to your wife just now?" "Polly heard it," said Tootle, jerking his hat over his shoulder in the direction of the door with an air of perfect confidence in his better half. "It's all right. But I asked you if you heard it. You that I suppose and understood it," pursued Mr. Dombey. "I eat it," said Tootle, "but I don't know as I understood it rightly, sir, account of being no scholar, and the words being Oscared and rather high. But Polly, idiot, it's all right as you appear to leave everything to her," said Mr. Dombey, frustrated in his intention of impressing his views still more distinctly on the husband as the stronger character. "I suppose it is of no use my saying anything to you." "Not a bit," said Tootle. "Polly, ain't it? She's awake, sir. I won't detain you any longer then," returned Mr. Dombey, disappointed. "Where have you worked all your life?" "Mostly underground, sir, till I got married. I come to the level, then I'm a-going on one of these here railroads when they comes into full play," as he added in one of his hoarse whispers. "We means to bring up little Billy to that line." Mr. Dombey inquired haughtily who little Billy was. "The eldest on him, sir," said Tootle with a smile. "It ain't a common name, so much so that when he was took to church, the gentleman said it warn't a christening one, and he couldn't give it. But we always called him Billy just the same, for we don't mean no harm." "Not we, do you mean to say, man," inquired Mr. Dombey, looking at him with marked displeasure, "that you have called a child after a boiler?" "No, no, sir," returned Tootle with a tender consideration for his mistake. "I should hope not. No, sir, I'd rather a boiler, sir. The steam engine was almost as good as a godfather to him, and so we called him Boiler. Don't you see, as the last straw breaks the laden camel's back." This piece of information crushed the sinking spirits of Mr. Dombey. He motioned his child's foster father to the door, who departed by no means unwillingly, and then turning the key paced up and down the room in solitary wretchedness. It would be harsh, and perhaps not altogether true to say of him, that he felt these rubs and gratings against his pride more keenly than he had felt his wife's death, but certainly they impressed that event upon him with new force and communicated to it added weight and bitterness. It was a rude shock to his sense of property in his child that these people, the mere dust of the earth as he thought them, should be necessary to him, and it was natural that in proportion as he felt disturbed by it, he should deplore the occurrence which had made them so. For all his starched impenetrable dignity and composure, he wiped blinding tears from his eyes as he paced up and down his room, and often said with an emotion of which he would not for the world have had a witness, "Poor little fellow." It may have been characteristic of Mr. Dumby's pride that he pitied himself through the child, not poor me, not poor widow or confiding by constraint in the wife of an ignorant hind who has been working mostly underground all of his life, and yet at whose door death had never knocked, and at whose poor table for sons daily sit, but poor little fellow, those words being on his lips, it occurred to him, and it is an instance of the strong attraction with which his hopes and fears and all his thoughts were tending to one center, that a great temptation was being placed in this woman's way. Her infant was a boy. To now would it be possible for her to change them? Though he was soon satisfied that he had dismissed the idea as romantic and unlikely though possible, there was no denying he could not help pursuing it so far as to entertain within himself a picture of what his condition would be if he should discover such an impostor when he was grown old, whether a man so situated would be able to pluck away the result of so many years of usage, confidence, and belief from the impostor and endow a stranger with it. But it was idle speculating, thus it couldn't happen in a moment afterwards. He determined that it could, but that such women were constantly observed and had no opportunity given them for the accomplishment of such a design, even when they were so wicked as to entertain it. In another moment, he was remembering how few such cases seemed to have ever happened. In another moment, he was wondering whether they ever happened and were not found out as his unusual emotions subsided. These misgivings gradually melted away, though so much of their shadow remained behind that he was constant in his resolution to look closely after Richards himself, without appearing to do so, being now in an easier frame of mind. He regarded the woman's station as rather an advantageous circumstance than otherwise, by placing in itself a broad distance between her and the child and rendering their separation easy and natural. Thence he passed to the contemplation of the future glories of Danby and Son, and dismissed the memory of his wife for the time being with a tributary sigh or two. Meanwhile, terms were ratified and agreed upon between Mrs. Chick and Richards, with the assistance of Miss Tox, and Richards being with much ceremony invested with the Dobby baby as if it were an order resigned. Her own, with many tears and kisses to Jemima, glasses of wine were then produced to sustain the drooping spirits of the family, and Miss Tox, busying herself in dispensing tastes to the younger branches, bred them up to their father's business with such surprising expedition that she made chockers of 4 of them in a quarter of a minute. "You'll take a glass yourself, sir, won't you?" said Miss Tox as Tootle appeared. "Thank you, Mum," said Tootle, "since you are suppressing, and you're very glad to leave your dear good wife in such a comfortable home, ain't you, sir?" said Miss Tox, nodding and winking at him stealthily. "No, ma'am," said Tootle, "he's wishing of her back." Again Polly cried more than ever at this, so Mrs. Chick, who had her matronly apprehensions that this indulgence in grief might be prejudicial to the little Dumby asset, indeed, she whispered to Miss Tox, "Hasten to the rescue, your little child will thrive charmingly with your sister Jemima." "Richards," said Mrs. Chick, "and you only have to make an effort. This is a world of effort, you know, Richards, to be very happy indeed. You have been already measured for your mourning, haven't you, Richards?" "Yes, ma'am," sobbed Polly, "and it'll fit beautifully, I know," said Mrs. Chick, "for the same young person has made me many dresses, the very best materials to law." "You'll be so smart," said Miss Tox, "that your husband won't know you, will you, sir?" "I should know her," said Tootle gruffly. "Anyhows and anyways, Tootle was evidently not to be bought over as to living. Richards, you know," pursued Mrs. Chick, "why, the very best of everything will be at your disposal. You will order your little dinner every day, and anything you take a fancy to I'm sure will be as readily provided as if you were a lady." "Yes, to be sure," said Miss Tox, keeping up the ball with great sympathy. "And as to porter, quite unlimited, will it not, Louisa?" "Oh, certainly," returned Mrs. Chick in the same tone, with a little abstinence. You know, my dear, in point of vegetables and pickles perhaps, suggested Miss Stocks. With such exceptions, said Louisa, she consult her choice entirely, and be under no restraint at all, my love. And then of course you know, said Miss Stocks, however fond she is of her own dear little child, and I'm sure, Louisa, you don't blame her for being fond of it. Oh no, cried Mrs. Chick benignly. Still, resumed Miss Tokes, she naturally must be interested in her young charge, and must consider it a privilege to see a little cherub connected with the superior classes gradually unfolding itself from day to day at one common fountain. Is it not so, Louisa? Most undoubtedly, said Mrs. Chick. You see, my love, she's already quite contented and comfortable, and means to say goodbye to her sister Jemima, and her little pets, and her good honest husband with a light heart and a smile, don't she, my dear? Oh yes, cried Miss Tokes, to be sure she does. Notwithstanding which, however, poor Polly embraced them all round in great distress, and coming to her spouse at last, could not make up a mind apart from him, until he gently disengaged himself at the close of the following allegorical piece of consolation. Polly, old woman, whatever you do, my darling, hold up your head and fight low. That's the only rule, as I know on, that'll carry anyone through life. You always have held up your head and fought low, Polly. Do it now, or bricks is no longer so. So God bless you, Polly. Me and your mamma will do your duty by you, and with relating to your own, hold up your head and fight low, Polly, and you can't go wrong fortified by this golden secret. Polly finally ran away to avoid any more particular leave taking between herself and the children, but the stratagem hardly succeeded as well as it deserved for the smallest. But one boy, divining her intent, immediately began swarming upstairs after her, if that word of doubt will etymology be admissible, on his arms and legs, while the eldest known in the family by the name of Byler, in remembrance of the steam engine, beat a demoniacal tattoo with his boots expressive of grief, in which he was joined by the rest of the family. A quantity of oranges and hampers thrust indiscriminately on each young Tootle checked the first violence of their regret, and the family was speedily transported to their own home by means of the hackney coach kept in waiting for that purpose. The children, under the guardianship of Jemima, blocked up the window and dropped out oranges and halfpence all the way along. Mr. Tootle himself preferred to ride behind among the spikes, as being the mode of conveyance to which he was best accustomed. Chapter 3, in which Mr. Dombey, as a man and a father, is seen at the head of the home department, the funeral of the deceased lady having been performed to the entire satisfaction of the undertaker, as well as of the neighborhood at large, which is generally disposed to be captious on such a point, and is prone to take offense at any omissions or shortcomings in the ceremonies. The various members of Mr. Dombey's household subsided into their several places in the domestic system. That small world, like the great one out of doors, had the capacity of easily forgetting its dead, and when the cook had said she was a quiet-tempered lady, and the housekeeper had said it was the common lot, and the butler had said who'd have thought it, and the housemaid had said she couldn't hardly believe it, and the footman had said it seemed exactly like a dream, they had quite worn the subject out, and began to think their morning was wearing rusty too on Richards, who was established upstairs in a state of honorable captivity. The dawn of her new life seemed to break cold and gray. Mr. Dombey's house was a large one on the shady side of a tall, dark, dreadfully gentile street in the region between Portland Place and Bryanstone Square. It was a corner house with great wide areas containing cellars frowned upon by barred windows and leered at by crooked doors leading to dustbins. It was a house of dismal state, with a circular back to it containing a whole suite of drawing rooms looking upon a gravelled yard where to gaunt trees with blackened trunks and branches rattled rather than rustled. Their leaves were so smoke-dried the summer sun was never on the street, but in the morning about breakfast time, when it came with the water carts and the old clothesman and the people with geraniums and the umbrella mender and the man who trilled the little bell of the Dutch clock as he went along, it was soon gone again, to return no more that day, and the bands of music and the straggling punches shows going after it left it a prey to the most dismal of organs and white mice, with now and then a porcupine to vary the entertainments, until the butlers, whose families were dining out, began to stand at the house doors in the twilight, and the lamp-lighter made his nightly failure in attempting to brighten up the street with gas. It was as blank a house inside as outside, when the funeral was over, Mr. Dombey ordered the furniture to be covered up, perhaps to preserve it for the son, with whom his plans were all associated, and the rooms to be ungarished savings such as he retained for himself on the ground floor. Accordingly, mysterious shapes were made of tables and chairs heaped together in the middle of rooms and covered over with great winding sheets, bell handles, window blinds, and looking glasses being papered up in journals daily and weekly obtruded fragmentary accounts of deaths and dreadful murders, every chandelier or luster muffled in Holland looked like a monstrous tear depending from the ceiling's odors, as from vaults and damp places came out of the chimneys the dead and buried lady was awful in a picture frame of ghastly bandages. Every gust of wind that rose brought, eddying round the corner from the neighboring mews, some fragments of the straw that had been strewn before the house when she was ill-mildewed, remains of which were still cleaving to the neighborhood, and these being always drawn by some invisible attraction to the threshold of the dirty house, to let immediately opposite addressed a dismal eloquence to Mr. Dombey's windows. The apartments which Mr. Dombey reserved for his own inhabiting were attainable from the hall and consisted of a sitting room, a library, which was in fact a dressing room, so that the smell of hot pressed paper, vellum, morocco, and Russia leather contended in it with the smell of divers pairs of boots, and a kind of conservatory or little glass breakfast room beyond, commanding a prospect of the trees before mentioned, and generally speaking of a few prowling cats. These three rooms opened up upon one another in the morning, when Mr. Dombey was at his breakfast, in one or other of the two first mentioned of them, as well as in the afternoon, when he came home to dinner. A bell was rung for Richards to repair to this glass chamber, and there walked to and fro with her young charge, from the glimpses she caught of Mr. Dandy at these times sitting in the dark distance, looking out towards the infant from among the dark, heavy furniture. The house had been inhabited for years by his father, and in many of its appointments was old-fashioned and grim. She began to entertain ideas of him in his solitary state, as if he were a lone prisoner in a cell or a strange apparition that was not to be accosted or understood. Mr. Dombey came to be, in the course of a few days, invested in his own person, to her simple thinking, with all the mystery and gloom of his house. As she walked up and down the glass room, or sat hushing the baby there, which she very often did for hours together, when the dusk was closing into, she would sometimes try to pierce the gloom beyond and make out how he was looking and what he was doing, sensible that she was plainly to be seen by him. However, she never dared to pry in that direction, but very furtively, and for a moment at a time. Consequently, she made out nothing, and Mr. Dombey in his den remained. A very shade. Little Paul Dombey's foster mother had led this life herself, and had carried little Paul through it for some weeks, and had returned upstairs one day from a melancholy saunter through the dreary rooms of state. She never went out without Mrs. Chick, who called on fine mornings, usually accompanied by Miss Stocks, to take her and baby for an airing, or in other words, to march them gravely up and down the pavement like a walking funeral. When, as she was sitting in her own room, the door was slowly and quietly opened, and a dark-eyed little girl looked in. "It's Miss Florence come home from her aunt's, no doubt," thought Richards, who had never seen the child before. "Hope I see you well, miss. Is that my brother?" asked the child, pointing to the baby. "Yes, my pretty," answered Richards. "Come and kiss him." But the child, instead of advancing, looked Heronius in the face and said, "What have you done with my mamma?" "Lord bless the little critter," cried Richards. "What a sad question." "I done nothing, miss." "What have they done with my mamma?" inquired the child, with exactly the same look and manner. "I never saw such a melting thing in all my life," said Richards, who naturally substituted for this child one of her own, inquiring for herself in like circumstances. "Come nearer here, my dear miss. Don't be afraid of me." "I'm not afraid of you," said the child, drawing nearer. "But I want to know what they have done with my mamma." Her heart swelled so, as she stood before the woman, looking into her eyes, that she was fain to press her little hand upon her breast and hold it there. Yet there was a purpose in the child that prevented both her slender figure and her searching gaze from faltering. "My darling," said Richards, "you wear that pretty black frock in remembrance of your mamma." "I can remember my mamma," returned the child, with tears springing to her eyes. "Eat any frog. But people put on black to remember people when they're gone." "We're gone," asked the child. "Come and sit down by me," said Richards, "and I'll tell you a story." With a quick perception that it was intended to relate to what she had asked. Little Florence laid aside the bonnet she had held in her hand until now and sat down on a stool at the nurse's feet, looking up into her face. "Once upon a time," said Richards, "there was a lady, a very good lady, and her little daughter dearly loved her. A very good lady, and her little daughter dearly loved her," repeated the child, "who, when God thought it right that it should be so, was taken ill and died." The child shuddered. "Died, never to be seen again by anyone on earth, and was buried in the ground where the trees grow." "The cold ground," said the child, shuddering again. "No, the warm ground," returned Polly, seizing her advantage, "where the ugly little seeds turn into beautiful flowers and into grass and corn. I like to know what all besides, where good people turn into bright angels and fly away to heaven." The child, who had dropped her head, raised it again and sat looking at her intently. "So let me see," said Polly, not a little flurried between this earnest scrutiny, her desire to comfort the child, her sudden success, and her very slight confidence in her own powers. "So when this lady died, wherever they took her or wherever they put her, she went to God and she prayed to him." "This lady did," said Polly, affecting herself beyond measure, being heartily in earnest to teach her little daughter to be sure of that in her heart, and to know that she was happy there, and loved her still, and to hope and try all her life to meet her there one day, never, never, never to part any more. "It was my mamma," exclaimed the child, springing up and clasping her round the neck. "And the child's heart," said Polly, drawing her to her breast. The little daughter's heart was so full of the truth of this that even when she heard it from a strange nurse that couldn't tell it right, but was a poor mother herself, and that was all she found a comfort in, it didn't feel so lonely, sobbed and cried upon her bosom, took kindly to the baby lying in her lap. "And there," said Polly, smoothing the child's curls and dropping tears upon them. "There, poor dear. Oh well, Miss Floyd, I won't your pa be angry neither," cried a quick voice at the door, proceeding from a short, brown, womanly girl of 14, with a little snub nose and black eyes like jet beads. "When it was ticklerly given out that you wasn't to go, and worried the witness, she don't worry me," was the surprised rejoinder of Polly. "I'm very fond of children, oh, but begging your pardon, Mrs. Richards, that don't matter, you know," returned the black-eyed girl, who was so desperately sharp and biting that she seemed to make one's eyes water. "I may be very fond of pennywinkles, Mrs. Richards, but it don't follow that I'm to have 'em for tea." "Well, it don't matter," said Polly. "Oh, thanky, Mrs. Richards, don't it," returned the sharp girl, "remembering, however, if you'll be so good, that Miss Floyd's under my charge, and Master Paul's under yon. But still we needn't quarrel," said Polly. "Oh no, Mrs. Richards," rejoins Spitfire, "not at all. I don't wish it. We needn't stand upon that footing, Miss Floyd being a permanency, Master Paul a temporary." Spitfire made use of none but pauses, shooting out whatever she had to say in one sentence and in one breath. "If possible, Miss Florence has just come home, isn't she?" asked Polly. "Yes, Mrs. Richards, just come and hear Miss Floyd before you've been in the house a quarter of an hour. You go a smearing your wet face against the expensive mourning that Mrs. Richards is wearing for your ma." With this remonstrance, young Spitfire, whose real name was Susan Nipper, detached the child from her new friend by a wrench as if she were a tooth, but she seemed to do it more in the excessively sharp exercise of her official functions than with any deliberate unkindness. "She be quite happy now she's come home again," said Polly, nodding to her with an encouraging smile upon her wholesome face, "and will be so pleased to see her dear papa tonight." "Look, Mrs. Richards," cried Miss Nipper, taking up her words with a jerk, "don't see her dear papa. Indeed, I should like to see her do it him, won't she?" then asked Polly. "Lord, Mrs. Richards, now her paws are dealt to wrapped up in somebody else, and before there was a somebody else to be wrapped up in, she never was a favorite. Girls are thrown away in this house, Mrs. Richards, I assure you." The child looked quickly from one nurse to the other as if she understood and felt what was said. "You surprise me," cried Polly. "Hasn't Mr. Dombey seen us since?" "No," interrupted Susan Nipper, "not once since, and he hadn't hardly set his eyes upon her before that. 4 months and months, and I don't think he'd have known her for his own child if he'd met her in the streets, or would know her for his own child if he was to meet her in the streets tomorrow, Mrs. Richards, as to me," said Spitfire with a giggle. "I doubt if he's aware of my existence." "Pretty dear," said Richards, meaning not Miss Nipper, but the little Florence. "Oh, there's a Tartar within 100 miles of where we're now in conversation, I can tell you, Mrs. Richards, present company always accepted." To said Susan Nipper, wish you good morning, Mrs. Richards. Now, Miss Florence, you come along with me, and don't go hanging back like a naughty, wicked child at judgments, is no example to don't, in spite of being thus adjured and in spite also of some hauling on the part of Susan Nipper tending towards the dislocation of her right shoulder. Little Florence broke away and kissed her new friend affectionately, oh dear, after it was given out so ticklishly that Mrs. Richards wasn't to be made free with. Exclaimed Susan. Very well, Miss Floy, God bless the sweet thing, said Richards. Goodbye, dear. Goodbye, returned the child. God bless you. I shall come to see you again soon, and you'll come to see me. Susan will let us, won't you? Susan Spitfire seemed to be in the main a good-natured little body, although a disciple of that school of trainers of the young idea, which holds that childhood like money must be shaken and rattled and jostled about a good deal to keep it bright. For being thus appealed to with some endearing gestures and caresses, she folded her small arms and shook her head and conveyed a relenting expression into her very wide open black eyes. It ain't right of you to ask it, Miss Floyer, for you know I can't refuse you, but Mrs. Richards and me will see what can be done if Mrs. Richards likes. I may wish you see to take a voyage to chaining Mrs. Richards, but I may know how to leave the London docks. Richards assented to the proposition. This house ain't so exactly ringing with merry-making, said Miss Nipper, that one need be lonelier than one must be. Your toxes and your chickses may draw out my to front double teeth, Mrs. Richards, but that's no reason why I need offer the whole set. This proposition was also assented to by Richards as an obvious one. So I'm able, I'm sure, said Susan Nipper, to live friendly, Mrs. Richards, while Master Paul continues a permanency, if the means can be planned out without going openly against orders. But goodness gracious, Mibbs, for you haven't got your things off yet, you naughty child. You haven't come along. With these words, Susan Nipper, in a transport of coercion, made a charge at her young ward and swept her out of the room. The child, in her grief and neglect, was so gentle, so quiet and uncomplaining, was possessed of so much affection that no one seemed to care to have, and so much sorrowful intelligence that no one seemed to mind or think about. The wounding of that Polly's heart was sore. When she was left alone again in the simple passage that had taken place between herself and the motherless little girl, her own motherly heart had been touched no less than the child's, and she felt as the child did that there was something of confidence and interest between them from that moment. Notwithstanding Mr. Tootle's great reliance on Polly, she was perhaps in point of artificial accomplishments very little his superior. She had been good-humoredly working and drudging for her life all her life, and was a sober, steady-going person with matter-of-fact ideas about the butcher and baker and the division of pens and ink things. But she was a good plain sample of a nature that is ever in the mass better, truer, higher, nobler, quicker to feel, and much more constant to retain all tenderness and pity, self-denial and devotion than the nature of men, and perhaps, and learned as she was, she could have brought a dawning knowledge home to Mr. Dobby at that early day, which would not then have struck him in the end like lightning. But this is from the purpose. Polly only thought at that time of improving on her successful preparation of Miss Snipper and devising some means of having little Florence aid her lawfully and without rebellion. An opening happened to present itself. That very night she had been rung down into the classroom as usual and had walked about and about it a long time with the baby in her arms, when to her great surprise and dismay, Mr. Dombey, whom she had seen at first leaning on his elbow at the table and afterwards walking up and down the middle room, drawing each time a little nearer, she thought, to the open folding doors, came out suddenly and stopped before her. Good evening. Richards, just the same austere, stiff gentleman as he had appeared to her on that first day, such a hard-looking gentleman that she involuntarily dropped her eyes and her curtsy at the same time. How is Master Paul Richards? Quite thriving, sir. And, well, he looks so, said Mr. Dombey, glancing with great interest at the tiny face she uncovered for his observation, and yet affecting to be half careless of it. They give you everything you want, I hope? Oh yes, thank you, sir, she suddenly appended. Such an obvious hesitation to this reply, however, that Mr. Dombey, who had turned away, stopped and turned round again inquiringly. If you please, sir, the child is very much disposed to take notice of things, said Richards with another curtsy. And Upstairs is a little dull for him, perhaps, sir. I beg them to take you out for airings constantly, said Mr. Dobby. Very well, you shall go out often now. You're quite right to mention it. I beg your pardon, sir, faltered Polly. But we go out quite plenty, sir. Thank you. What would you have then? asked Mr. Dumby. Indeed, sir, I don't exactly know, said Polly, unless, yes, I believe nothing is so good for making children lively and cheerful, sir, as seeing other children playing about him, observed Polly, taking courage. I think I mentioned to you, Richards, when you came here, said Dobby with a frown, that I wished you to see as little of your family as possible. Oh dear, yes, sir, I wasn't so much as thinking of that. I'm glad of it, said Dobby hastily. You can continue your walk if you please. With that he disappeared into his inner room, and Polly had the satisfaction of feeling that he had thoroughly misunderstood her object, and that she had fallen into disgrace without the least advancement of her purpose. Next night she found him walking about the conservatory. When she came down, as she stopped at the door, checked by this unusual sight and uncertain whether to advance or retreat, he called her in his mind was too much set on Dombey and Son. It soon appeared to admit of his having forgotten her suggestion. If you really think that sort of society is good for the child, he said sharply, as if there had been no interval since she proposed it, where's Miss Florence? Nothing could be better than Miss Florence, sir, said Polly eagerly. But I understood from her maid that they were not to. Mr. Dombey rang the bell and walked till it was answered. Tell them always to let Miss Florence be with Richards when she chooses, and go out with her, and so forth. Tell them to let the children be together when Richards wishes it. The iron was now hot, and Richard striking on it boldly. It was a good cause, and she bowled in it, though instinctively afraid of Mr. Dobby. Requested that Miss Florence might be sent down then, and there to make friends with her little brother. She feigned to be dandling the child as the servant retired on this at dawn. But she thought she saw Mr. Dombey's color change, that the expression of his face quite altered, that he turned hurriedly as if to gainsay what he had said, or she had said, or both, and was only deterred by very shame. And she was right the last time he had seen his slighted child. There had been that in the sad embrace between her and her dying mother which was at once a revelation and a reproach to him. Let him be absorbed as he would in the son on whom he built such high hopes. He could not forget that closing scene. He could not forget that he had had no part in it, that at the bottom of its clear depth of tenderness and truth lay those two figures clasped in each other's arms, while he stood on the bank above them, looking down, a mere spectator, not a sharer with them, quite shut out, unable to exclude these things from his remembrance, or to keep his mind free from such imperfect shapes of the meaning with which they were fraught as were able to make themselves visible to him through the mist of his pride. His previous feeling of indifference towards little Florence changed into an uneasiness of an extraordinary kind, young as she was and possessing in any eyes but his, and perhaps in his, to even more than the usual amount of childish simplicity and confidence. He almost felt as if she watched and distrusted him, as if she held the clue to something secret in his breast of the nature of which he was hardly informed himself, as if she had an innate knowledge of one jarring and discordant string within him, and her very breath could sound it. His feeling about the child had been negative from her birth. He had never conceived an aversion to her. It had not been worth his while or in his humor. She had never been a positively disagreeable object to him. But now he was ill at ease about her. She troubled his peace. He would have preferred to put her idea aside altogether if he had known how. Perhaps who shall decide on such mysteries? He was afraid that he might come to hate her when little Florence timidly presented herself. Mr. Dombey stopped in his pacing up and down and looked towards her. Had he looked with greater interest and with a father's eye, he might have read in her keen glance the impulses and fears that made her waver, the passionate desire to run, clinging to him, crying as she hid her face in his embrace, "Oh, Father, try to love me, there's no one else." The dread of a repulse, the fear of being too bold and of offending him, the pitiable need in which he stood of some assurance and encouragement, and how her overcharged young heart was wandering to find some natural resting place for its sorrow and affection. But he saw nothing of this. He saw her pause irresolutely at the door and looked towards him, and he saw no more. "Come." And he said, "Come in. What is the child afraid of?" She came in, and after glancing round her for a moment with an uncertain air stood pressing her small hands hard together close within the door. "Come here, Florence," said her father coldly. "Do you know who I am?" "Yes, Papa." "Have you nothing to say to me?" The tears that stood in her eyes as she raised them quickly to his face were frozen by the expression at war. She looked down again and put out her trembling hand. Mr. Dobby took it loosely in his own and stood looking down upon her for a moment, as if he knew as little as the child what to say or do. "There, be a good girl," he said, patting her on the head and regarding her as it were by stealth with a disturbed and doubtful look. "Go, Drew Richards, go." His little daughter hesitated for another instant, as though she would have clung about him still, or had some lingering hope that he might raise her in his arms and kiss her. She looked up in his face once more. He thought how like her expression was then to what it had been when she looked round at the doctor that night, and instinctively dropped her hand and turned away. It was not difficult to perceive that Florence was at a great disadvantage in her father's presence. It was not only a constraint upon the child's mind, but even upon the natural grace and freedom of her actions. As she sported and played about her baby brother that night, her manner was seldom so winning and so pretty as it naturally was, and sometimes, when in his pacing to and fro he came near her, she had perhaps for the moment forgotten him. It changed upon the instant, became forced and embarrassed. Still Polly persevered, with all the better heart for seeing this, and judging of Mr. Dombey by herself, had great confidence in the mute appeal of poor little Florence's morning dress. "It's hard indeed," thought Polly, "if he takes only to one little motherless child when he has another, and that a girl before his eyes." So Polly kept her before his eyes as long as she could, and managed so well with little Paul as to make it very plain that he was all the livelier for his sister's company. When it was time to withdraw upstairs again, she would have sent Florence into the inner room to say good night to her father, but the child was timid and drew back, and when she urged her again said, spreading her hands before her eyes as if to shut out her own unworthiness, "Oh no, no, he don't want me, he don't want me." The little altercation between them had attracted the notice of Mr. Dombey, who inquired from the table where he was sitting at his wine what the matter was. Miss Florence was afraid of interrupting. "Sir, if she came in to say good night," said Richards. "It doesn't matter," returned Mr. Dombey. "You can let her come and go without regarding me." The child shrunk as she listened and was gone before her humble friend looked round again. However, Polly triumphed not a little in the success of her well-intentioned scheme, and in the address with which she had brought it to bear, whereof she made a full disclosure to Spitfire. When she was once more safely entrenched upstairs, Miss Nipper received that proof of her confidence, as well as the prospect of their free association for the future, rather coldly, and was anything but enthusiastic in her demonstrations of joy. "I thought you would have been pleased," said Polly. "Oh yes, Mrs. Richards, I'm very well pleased, thank you," returned Susan, who had suddenly become so very upright that she seemed to have put an additional bone in her stays. "You don't show it," said Polly. "Oh, being only a permanency, I couldn't be expected to show it like a temporary," said Susan Nipper. "Temporaries carries it all before a mirror, I find. But though there's an excellent party wall between this house and the next, I may not exactly like to go to it." Mrs. Richards, notwithstanding Chapter 4, in which some more first appearances are made on the stage of these adventures, though the offices of Dombey and Son were within the liberties of the city of London, and within hearing of Bow Bells, when their clashing voices were not drowned by the uproar in the streets, yet were there hints of adventurous and romantic story to be observed in some of the adjacent objects. Gog and Magog held their state within 10 minutes' walk. The Royal Exchange was close at hand, the Bank of England, with its vaults of gold and silver down among the dead men underground, was their magnificent neighbor. Just round the corner stood the rich East India House, teeming with suggestions of precious stuffs and stones, tigers, elephants, howlers, hookers, umbrellas, palm trees, palanquins, and gorgeous princes of a brown complexion, sitting on carpets with their slippers very much turned up at the toes. Anywhere in the immediate vicinity there might be seen pictures of ships speeding away full sail to all parts of the world, outfitting warehouses ready to pack off anybody anywhere, fully equipped in half an hour, and little timber midshipmen in obsolete naval uniforms eternally employed outside the shop doors of nautical instrument makers in taking observations of the hackney carriage's sole master and proprietor of one of these effigies of that which might be called familiarly the wittiest of that which thrust itself out above the pavement, right leg foremost with a suavity the least endurable, and had the shoe buckles and flapped waistcoat the least reconcilable to human reason, and bore at its right eye the most offensively disproportionate piece of machinery, sole master and proprietor of that midshipman, and proud of him to an elderly gentleman in a Welsh wig, had paid house rent, taxes, rates, and dues for more years than many a full-grown midshipman of flesh and blood has numbered in his life, and midshipmen, who have attained a pretty green old age, have not been wanting in the English Navy the stock in trade of this old gentleman. Comprised chronometers, barometers, telescopes, compasses, charts, maps, sextants, quadrants, and specimens of every kind of instrument used in the working of a ship's course, or the keeping of a ship's reckoning, or the prosecuting of a ship's discoveries. Objects in brass and glass were in his drawers, and on his shelves, which none but the initiated could have found the top of, or guessed the use of, or having once examined, could have ever got back again into their mahogany nests without assistance. Everything was jammed into the tightest cases, fitted into the narrowest corners, fenced up behind the most impertinent cushions, and screwed into the acutest angles to prevent its philosophical composure from being disturbed by the rolling of the sea. Such extraordinary precautions were taken in every instance to save room and keep the thing compact, and so much practical navigation was fitted and cushioned and screwed into every box, whether the box was a mere slab as some were, or something between a cocked hat and a starfish as others were, and those quite mild and modest boxes, as compared with others, that the shop itself, partaking of the general infection, seemed almost to become a snug sea-going ship-shape concern, wanting only good sea room in the event of an unexpected launch to work its way securely to any desert island in the world. Many minor incidents in the household life of the ship's instrument maker, who was proud of his little midshipman, assisted and bore out this fancy. His acquaintance, lying chiefly among ship chandlers, and so forth, he had always plenty of the veritable ship's biscuit on his table. It was familiar with dried meats and tongues possessing an extraordinary flavor. Of rope yarn, pickles were produced upon it in great wholesale jars, with dealer in all kinds of ship's provisions on the label. Spirits were set forth in case bottles, with no throats, old prints of ships, with alphabetical references to their various mysteries hung in frames upon the walls. The Tartar frigate underway was on the plates. Outlandish shells, seaweeds, and mosses decorated the chimney piece. The little wing-scudded back parlor was lighted by a skylight like a cabin. Here he lived to in skipper-like state, all alone, with his nephew Walter, a boy of 14, who looked quite enough like a midshipman to carry out the prevailing idea. But there it ended, for Solomon Gills himself, more generally called Old Soul, was far from having a maritime appearance, to say nothing of his Welsh wig, which was as plain and stubborn a Welsh wig as ever was worn, and in which he looked like anything but a rover. He was a slow, quiet-spoken, thoughtful old fellow, with eyes as red as if they had been small suns, looking at you through a fog, and a newly awakened manner, such as he might have acquired by having stared for 3 or 4 days successively through every optical instrument in his shop, and suddenly came back to the world again to find it green. The only change of a known in his outward man was from a complete suit of coffee color, cut very square, unornamented with glaring buttons, to the same suit of coffee color, minus the inexpressibles, which were then of a pale nankeen. He wore a very precise shirt frill, and carried a pair of first-rate spectacles on his forehead, and a tremendous chronometer in his fob. Rather than doubt which precious possession, he would have believed in a conspiracy against it on part of all the clocks and watches in the city, and even of the very sun itself. Such as he was, such he had been in the shop and parlor behind the little midshipman for years upon years, going regularly aloft to bed every night in a howling galleon remote from the lodges, where when gentlemen of England who lived below at ease had little or no idea of the state of the weather, it often blew great guns. It is 5:30 o'clock, and an autumn afternoon, when the reader and Solomon Gills become acquainted. Solomon Gills is in the act of seeing what time it is by the unimpeachable chronometer. The usual daily clearance has been making in the city for an hour or more, and the human tide is still rolling westward. The streets have thinned, as Mr. Gill says, very much. It threatens to be wet tonight. All the weather glasses in the shop are in low spirits, and the rain already shines upon the cocked head of the wooden midshipman. Where's Walter, I wonder, said Solomon Gills after he had carefully put up the chronometer again. Here's dinner been ready half an hour, and no Walter. Turning round upon his stool behind the counter, Mr. Gills looked out among the instruments in the window to see if his nephew might be crossing the road. No, he was not among the bobbing umbrellas, and he certainly was not the newspaper boy in the oilskin cap who was slowly working his way along the piece of brass outside, writing his name over Mr. Gill's name with his forefinger if I didn't. No, he was too fond of me to make a run for it and go and enter himself aboard ship against my wishes. I should begin to be fidgety, said Mr. Gills, tapping 2 or 3 weather glasses with his knuckles. I really should all in the downs, lots of moisture. Well, it's wanted, I believe, said Mr. Gills, blowing the dust off the glass top of a compass case, that you don't point more direct and due to the back parlor than the boy's inclination does after all, and the parlor couldn't bear straighter either due north, not the 20th part of a point either way. Hello, Uncle Sol. Hello, my boy, cried the instrument maker, turning briskly round. What, you are here? Are you a cheerful-looking merry boy fresh from running home in the rain? Fair-faced, bright-eyed, and curly-headed. Well, Uncle, how have you got on without me all day? Is dinner ready? I'm so hungry as to getting on, said Solomon good-naturedly. It would be odd if I couldn't get on without a young dog like you a great deal better than with you. As to dinner being ready, it's been ready this half hour, and waiting for you. As to being hungry, I am come along then, Uncle, cried the boy. Hooray for the Admiral. Confound the Admiral, returned Solomon Gills. You mean the Lord Mayor? No, I don't, cried the boy. Hooray for the Admiral, hooray for the Admiral. For what? At this word of command, the Welsh wig and its wearer were borne without resistance into the back parlor, as at the head of a boarding party of 500 men, and Uncle Sol and his nephew were speedily engaged on a fried sole, with a prospect of steak to follow. The Lord Mayor, Wally, said Solomon. Forever no more admirals. The Lord Mayor is your admiral. Is he though, said the boy, shaking his head. Why, the sword bearers better than him. He draws his sword sometimes, and a pretty figure he cuts with it for his pains, returned the uncle. Listen to me, Wally, listen to me. Look on the mantel shelf. Why, who's cocked my silver mug up there on a nail? Exclaimed the boy. I have, said his uncle. No more mugs now. We must begin to drink out of glasses today, Walter. We are men of business. We belong to the city. We started in life this morning. Well, Uncle, said the boy, I'll drink out of anything you like so long as I can drink to you. Here's to you, Uncle Sol. And hooray for the Lord Mayor, interrupted the old man. For the Lord Mayor, Sheriff's Common Council, and livery, said the boy. Long life to him. The uncle nodded his head with great satisfaction. And now, he said, let's here's something about the firm. Oh, there's not much to be told about the firm, Uncle, said the boy, plying his knife and fork. It's a precious dark set of offices, and in the room where I sit there's a high fender and an iron safe and some cards about ships that are going to sail, and an almanac, and some desks and stools, and an ink bottle, and some books, and some boxes, and a lot of cobwebs, and in one of them just over my head a shriveled up blue bottle that looked as if it had hung there ever so long. Nothing else, said the uncle. No, nothing else except an old bird cage. I wonder how that ever came there, and a coal scuttle. No banker's books, or checkbooks, or bills, or such tokens of wealth rolling in from day to day, said old Sol, looking wistfully at his nephew out of the fog that always seemed to hang about him, and laying an anxious emphasis upon the words. Oh yes, plenty of that, I suppose, returned his nephew carelessly. But all that sort of thing's in Mr. Carker's room, or Mr. Morphine's, or Mr. Dombey's. Has Mr. Dombey been there today? Inquired the uncle. Oh yes, in and out all day. He didn't take any notice of you, I suppose? Yes, he did. He walked up to my seat. I wish he wasn't so solemn and stiff, Uncle, and said, oh, you are the son of Mr. Gills, the ship's instrument maker? Nephew, sir. I said, nephew, boy, said he. But I could take my oath. He said, son, Uncle, you're mistaken, I dare say. It's no matter. No, it's no matter. But he needn't have been so sharp. I thought there was no harm in it, though he did say, son. Then he told me that you had spoken to him about me, and that he had found me employment in the house accordingly, and that I was expected to be attentive and punctual. And then he went away. I thought he didn't seem to like me much. You mean, I suppose, observed the instrument maker, that you didn't seem to like him much? Well, Uncle, returned the boy, laughing. Perhaps so. I never thought of that. Solomon looked a little graver as he finished his dinner, and glanced from time to time at the boy's bright face when dinner was done, and the cloth was cleared away. The entertainment had been brought from a neighboring eating house. He lighted a candle and went down below into a little cellar, while his nephew, standing on the moldy staircase, dutifully held the light. After a moment's groping here and there, he presently returned with a very ancient-looking bottle covered with dust and dirt. "Why, Uncle Saul," said the boy, "what are you about? That's the wonderful Madeira. There's only one more bottle." Uncle Saul nodded his head, implying that he knew very well what he was about, and having drawn the cork in solemn silence, filled the glasses and set the bottle and a third clean glass on the table. "You shall drink the other bottle, Wally," he said, "when you come to good fortune, when you are a thriving, respected, happy man, when the start in life you have made today shall have brought you, as I pray heaven it may, to a smooth part of the course you have to run, my child. My love to you." Some of the fog that hung about Old Soul seemed to have got into his throat, for he spoke huskily. His hand shook too as he clinked his glass against his nephew's, but having once got the wine to his lips, he tossed it off like a man and smacked them. "Afterwards, dear uncle," said the boy, affecting to make light of it, while the tears stood in his eyes, "for the honor you have done me, etc., etc., I shall now beg to propose Mr. Solomon Gills with 3 and 1 sheer more, hurrah, and you'll return thanks, uncle, when we drink the last bottle together, won't you?" They clinked their glasses again, and Walter, who was hoarding his wine, took a sip of it and held the glass up to his eye with as critical an air as he could possibly assume. His uncle sat looking at him for some time in silence. When their eyes had last met, he began at once to pursue the theme that had occupied his thoughts aloud, as if he had been speaking all the time. "You see, Walter," he said, "in truth, this business is merely a habit with me. I'm so accustomed to the habit that I could hardly live if I relinquished it. But there's nothing doing." When that uniform was worn, pointing out towards the little midshipman, then indeed fortunes were to be made, and were made. But competition, new invention, alteration. The world's gone past me. I hardly know where I am myself, much less where my customers are. "Never mind him, uncle, since you came home from weekly boarding school at Peckham, for instance. And that's 10 days, said Solomon. "I don't remember more than one person that has come into the shop to uncle. Don't you recollect? There was the man who came to ask for change for a sovereign." "That's the one," said Solomon. "Why, uncle, don't you call the woman anybody who came to ask the way to my land turnpike?" "Oh, it's true," said Solomon. "I forgot her to person. To be sure they didn't buy anything," cried the boy. "No, they didn't buy anything," said Solomon quietly. "Nor want anything," cried the boy. "No, if they had, they'd gone to another shop," said Solomon in the same tone. "But there were 2 of them, uncle," cried the boy, as if that were a great triumph. "You said only one." "Well, Wally," resumed the old man, after a short pause, "not being like the savages who came on Robinson Crusoe's island, we can't live on a man who asks for change for a sovereign and a woman who inquires the way to Malene Turnpike. As I said just now, the world has gone past me. I don't blame it, but I no longer understand it. Tradesmen are not the same as they used to be. Apprentices are not the same. Business is not the same. Business commodities are not the same. 7/8 of my stock is old-fashioned. I am an old-fashioned man in an old-fashioned shop in a street that is not the same as I remember it. I have fallen behind the time, and I'm too old to catch it again. Even the noise it makes a long way ahead confuses me." Walter was going to speak, but his uncle held up his hand. "Therefore, Wally, therefore it is that I am anxious you should be early in the busy world, and on the world's track. I am only the ghost of this business. Its substance vanished long ago, and when I die its ghost will be laid. As it is clearly no inheritance for you, then I have thought it best to use for your advantage almost the only fragment of the old connection that stands by me through long habit. Some people suppose me to be wealthy. I wish for your sake they were right. But whatever I leave behind me, or whatever I can give you in such a house as tombs are in the road, to use well and make the most of, be diligent, try to like it. My dear boy, work for a steady independence and be happy. I'll do everything I can, uncle, to deserve your affection. Indeed, I will, said the boy earnestly. "I know it," said Solomon. "I am sure of it." And he applied himself to a second glass of the old Madeira with increased relish. "As to the sea," he pursued, "that's well enough in fiction, Wally, but it won't do. In fact, it won't do at all. It's natural enough that you should think about it, associating it with all these familiar things. But it won't do, it won't do." Solomon Gills rubbed his hands with an air of stealthy enjoyment as he talked of the sea though, and looked on the seafaring objects about him. With inexpressible complacency. Think of this wine, for instance, said Old Soul, which has been to the East Indies and back. I'm not able to say how often, and has been once round the world. Think of the pitch dark nights, the roaring winds and rolling seas, the thunder, lightning, rain, hailstorms of all kinds, said the boy. To be sure, said Solomon, that this wine has passed through. Think what a straining and creaking of timbers and mast, what a whistling and howling of the gale through ropes and rigging, what a clambering aloft of men vying with each other, who shall lie out first upon the yards to furl the icy sails, while the ship rolls and pitches like mad, cried his nephew. Exactly so, said Solomon, has gone on over the old cask that held this wine. Why, when the charming Sally went down in the Baltic Sea in the dead of night, 5:20 past 12, when the captain's watch stopped in his pocket, he lying dead against the main mast on February 14th, 1749, cried Walter with great animation. To be sure, cried Old Sol, quite right. Then there were 500 casks of such wine aboard, and all hands except the first mate, first lieutenant, to seamen, and a lady in a leaky boat going to work to stave the casks, got drunk and died drunk, singing Rule Britannia when she settled, and went down an ending with one awful scream in chorus. But when the George II drove ashore, uncle, on the coast of Cornwall in a dismal gale 2 hours before daybreak on March 4th, 71, she had near to 100 horses aboard, and the horses breaking loose down below early in the gale and tearing to and fro and trampling each other to death, made such noises and set up such human cries that the crew, believing the ship to be full of devils, some of the best men losing heart and head, went overboard in despair, and only 2 were left alive at last to tell the tale. And when, said Old Soul, when the polyphemus private West India trader burdened 350 tons, Captain John Brown of Deptford, owners Wiggins and Company, cried Walter. The same, said Saul, when she took fire for days' sail, with a fair wind out of Jamaica harbor. In the night there were 2 brothers on board, interposed his nephew, speaking very fast and loud, and there was not being room for both of them in the only boat that wasn't swamped. Neither of them would consent to go, until the elder took the younger by the waist and flung him in, and then the younger, rising in the boat, cried out, Dear Edward, think of your promised wife at home. I'm only a boy, no one waits at home for me. Leaped down into my place and flung himself in the sea. The kindling eye and heightened color of the boy who had risen from his seat in the earnestness of what he said and felt seemed to remind Old Saul of something he had forgotten, or that is encircling mist that hitherto shut out, instead of proceeding with any more anecdotes as he had evidently intended. But a moment before he gave a short dry cough and said, Well, suppose we change the subject. The truth was that the simple-minded uncle, in his secret attraction towards the marvelous and adventurous, of which he was in some sort of distant relation by his trade, had greatly encouraged the same attraction in the nephew, and that everything that had ever been put before the boy to deter him from a life of adventure had had the usual unaccountable effect of sharpening his taste for it. This is invariable. It would seem as if there never was a book written or a story told expressly with the object of keeping boys on shore which did not lure and charm them to the ocean as a matter of course. But in addition to the little party now made its appearance in the shape of a gentleman in a wide suit of blue, with a hook instead of a hand attached to his right wrist, very bushy black eyebrows, and a thick stick in his left hand covered all over, like his nose, with knobs. He wore a loose black silk handkerchief round his neck, and such a very large coarse shirt collar that it looked like a small sail. He was evidently the person for whom the spare wine glass was intended, and evidently knew it, for having taken off his rough outer coat and hung up on a particular peg behind the door such a hard glazed hat as a sympathetic person's head might ache at the sight of, and which left a red rim round his own forehead as if he had been wearing a tight basin. He brought a chair to where the clean glass was and sat himself down behind it. He was usually addressed as Captain, this visitor, and had been a pilot or a skipper or a private seaman, or all 3 perhaps, and was a very salt-looking man indeed, his face remarkable for a brown solidity, brightened as he shook hands with uncle and nephew. But he seemed to be of a laconic disposition, and merely said, How goes it? All well, said Mr. Gills, pushing the bottle towards him. He took it up and having surveyed and smelt it, said with extraordinary expression, the returned the instrument maker, upon that he whistled as he filled his glass, and seemed to think they were making holiday. Indeed, Waller, he said, arranging his hair, which was then with his hook, and then pointing it at the instrument maker, look at him, love, honor, and obey, overhaul your catechism, till you find that passage, and when found turn the leaf down, success, my boy. He was so perfectly satisfied, both with his quotation and his reference to it, that he could not help repeating the words again in a low voice, and saying he had forgotten them these 40 year, but I never wanted to or 3 words in my life that I didn't know where to lay my hand upon. Girls, he observed, comes of not wasting language as some do. The reflection perhaps reminded him that he had better, like young Norval's father, increase his store. At any rate, he became silent, and remained so until old Saul went out into the shop to light it up, when he turned to Walter and said, without any introductory remark, I suppose he could make a clock. If he tried, I shouldn't wonder. Captain Cuttle, returned the boy, and it would go, said Captain Cuttle, making a species of serpentine. The air with his hook. Lord, how that clock would go. For a moment or two he seemed quite lost in contemplating the pace of this ideal timepiece, and sat looking at the boy as if his face were the dial. But he's chock full of science, he observed, waving his hook towards the stock in trade. Look here, here's a collection of them, earth, air, or water. It's all one, only say where you'll have it. Up in a balloon, there you are. Down in a bell, there you are. Do you want to put the North Star in a pair of scales and weigh it? He'll do it for you. It may be gathered from these remarks that Captain Cuttle's reverence for the stock of instruments was profound, and that his philosophy knew little or no distinction between trading in it and inventing it. Ah, he said with a sigh, it's a fine thing to understand them, and yet it's a fine thing not to understand them. I hardly know which is best. It's so comfortable to sit here and feel that you might be weighed, measured, magnified, electrified, polarized, played the very devil with, and never know how nothing short of the wonderful Madeira, combined with the occasion which rendered it desirable to improve and expand Walter's mind, could have ever loosened his tongue to the extent of giving utterance to this prodigious oration. He seemed quite amazed himself at the manner in which it opened up to view the sources of the taciturn delight he had had in eating Sunday dinners in that parlor for 10 years. Becoming a sadder and wiser man, he mused, and held his peace. Come, cried the subject of this admiration, returning, before you have your glass of grog, Ned, we must finish the bottle. Stand, boy, said Ned, filling his glass. Give the boy some more. No more, thank you, uncle. Yes, yes, said Sol, a little more. We'll finish the bottle. To the house, Ned. Walter's house. Why, it may be his house one of these days, in part. Who knows? Sir Richard Whittington married his master's daughter. Turn again, Whittington, Lord Mayor of London, and when you are old you will never depart from it, interposed the Captain. Waller, overhaul the book, my lad. And although Mr. Dobby hasn't a daughter, Saul began. Yes, yes, he is, uncle, said the boy, reddening and laughing. Has he? Cried the old man. Oh, indeed, I think he has. Oh, I know he has, said the boy. Some of them were talking about it in the office today, and they do say, uncle, and Captain Cuttle, lowering his voice, that he's taken a dislike to her, and that she's left unnoticed among the servants, and that his mind so set all the while upon having his son in the house, that although he's only a baby now, he's going to have balances struck oftener than formerly, and the books kept closer than they used to be, and has even been seen when he thought he wasn't walking in the docks, looking at his ships and property, and all that, as if he were exulting like over what he and his son will possess together. That's what they say. Of course, I don't know. He knows all about her already, you see, said the instrument maker. Nonsense, uncle, cried the boy, still reddening and laughing. Boy, like, how can I help hearing what they tell me? The sun's a little in our way at present, I'm afraid, Ned, said the old man, humoring the joke. Very much, said the captain. Nevertheless, we'll drink him, pursued Saul. So here's to Danby and son. Oh, very well, uncle, said the boy merrily, since you have introduced the mention of her, and have connected me with her, and have said that I know all about her, I shall make bold to amend the toast. So here's to Dobby and son and daughter. Chapter 5. Paul's progress and christening. Little Paul, suffering no contamination from the blood of the Toodles, grew stouter and stronger every day too. He was more and more ardently cherished by Miss Stocks, whose devotion was so far appreciated by Mr. Dobby that he began to regard her as a woman of great natural good sense, whose feelings did her credit and deserved encouragement. He was so lavish of this condescension that he not only bowed to her in a particular manner on several occasions, but even entrusted such stately recognitions of her to his sister as, "Pray tell your friend Louisa that she is very good," or mention to Miss Toxie Louisa that I am obliged to her specialties, which made a deep impression on the lady thus distinguished. Whether Miss Tox conceived that, having been selected by the fates to welcome the little Dombey before he was born in Kirby beard and Kirby's best mixed pins, it therefore naturally devolved upon her to greet him with all other forms of welcome in all other early stages of his existence, or whether her overflowing goodness induced her to volunteer into the domestic militia as a substitute in some sort for his deceased mama, or whether she was conscious of any other motives are questions which in this stage of the firm's history herself only could have solved, nor have they much bearing on the fact of which there is no doubt that Miss Tox's constancy and zeal were a heavy discouragement to Richards, who lost flesh hourly under her patronage and was in some danger of being superintended to death. Miss Tox was often in the habit of assuring Mrs. Chick that nothing could exceed her interest in all connected with the development of that sweet child, and an observer of Miss Tox's proceedings might have inferred so much without declaratory confirmation. She would preside over the innocent repasts of the young heir with ineffable satisfaction, almost with an air of joint proprietorship with Richards in the entertainment. At the little ceremonies of the bath and toilet she assisted with enthusiasm. The administration of infantine doses of physic awakened all the active sympathy of her character, and being on one occasion secreted in a cupboard whither she had fled in modesty, when Mr. Dombey was introduced into the nursery by his sister to behold his son in the course of preparation for bed, taking a short walk uphill over Richard's gown in a short and airy linen jacket, Miss Stokes was so transported beyond the ignorant present as to be unable to refrain from crying out, "Is he not beautiful, Mr. Dombey? Is he not Cupid, sir?" And then, almost sinking behind the closet door with confusion and blushes, Louisa said, "Mr. Dombey," one day to his sister, "I really think I must present your friend with some little token on the occasion of Paul's christening. She has exerted herself so warmly in the child's behalf from the first, and seems to understand her position so thoroughly, a very rare merit in this world. I am sorry to say that it would really be agreeable to me to notice her. Let it be no detraction from the merits of Miss Tox to hint that in Mr. Dombey's eyes, as in some others that occasionally see the light, they only achieved that mighty piece of knowledge, the understanding of their own position, who showed a fitting reverence for his. It was not so much their merit that they knew themselves as that they knew him and bowed low before him." "My dear Paul," returned his sister, "you do, Miss Tox, but just as a man of your penetration was sure I knew to do. I believe if there are 3 words in the English language for which she has a respect amounting almost to veneration, those words are Dombey and son." "Well said, Mr. Dombey. I believe it does Miss Tox credit. And as to anything in the shape of a token, my dear Paul," pursued his sister, "all I can say is that anything you give Miss Tox will be hoarded and prized, I am sure, like a relic. But there is a way, my dear Paul, of showing your sense of Miss Tox's friendliness in a still more flattering and acceptable manner, if you should be so inclined." "How is that?" asked Mr. Dombey. "Godfathers, of course," continued Mrs. Check, "are important in point of connection and influence. I don't know why they should be to my son," said Mr. Dombey coldly. "Very true, my dear Paul," retorted Mrs. Chick with an extraordinary show of animation to cover the suddenness of her conversion, "and spoken like yourself. I might have expected nothing else from you. I might have known that such would have been your opinion." "Perhaps your Mrs. Chick faltered again, as not quite comfortably feeling her way. "Perhaps that is a reason why you might have the less objection to allowing Miss Tox to be godmother to the dear thing. If it were only as deputy and proxy for someone else, that it would be received as a great honor and distinction." "Paul the First need not say, Louisa," said Mr. Dombey after a short pause. "It is not to be supposed, certainly not," cried Mrs. Check, hastening to anticipate a refusal. "I never thought it was." Mr. Dombey looked at her impatiently. "Don't flatter me, my dear Paul," said his sister, "for that destroys me. I am far from strong. I have not been quite myself since poor dear Fanny departed." Mr. Dombey glanced at the pocket handkerchief which his sister applied to her eyes and resumed. "It is not to be supposed, I say, and I say," murmured Mrs. Chick, That I never thought it was good heaven, Louisa said. Mr. Dobby, no, my dear Paul, she remonstrated with tearful dignity. I must really be allowed to speak. I am not so clever, or so reasoning, or so eloquent, or so anything as you are. I know that very well, so much the worse for me. But if they were the last words I had to utter, and last words should be very solemn to you and me, Paul, after poor dear Fanny, I would still say I never thought it was. And what is more, added Mrs. Chick with increased dignity, as if she had withheld her crushing argument, until now I never did think it was. Mr. Dobby walked to the window and walked back again. It is not to be supposed, Louisa, he said, Mrs. Chick had nailed her colors to the mast, and repeated, I know it isn't, but he took no notice of it, but that there are many persons who, supposing that I recognized any claim at all in such a case, have a claim upon me, superior to Miss Tox's. But I do not. I recognize no such thing, Paul, and myself will be able, when the time comes, to hold our own. The house, in other words, will be able to hold its own, and maintain its own, and hand down its own of itself, and without any such commonplace aids, the kind of foreign help which people usually seek for their children. I can afford to despise being above it. I hope so that Paul's infancy and childhood pass away well, and I see him becoming qualified, without waste of time, for the career on which he is destined to enter. I am satisfied he will make what powerful friends he pleases in afterlife, when he is actively maintaining and extending, if that is possible, the dignity and credit of the firm. Until then I am enough for him, perhaps, and all in all I have no wish that people should step in between us. I would much rather show my sense of the obliging conduct of a deserving person like your friend. Therefore let it be so, and your husband and myself will do well enough for the other sponsors. I dare say, in the course of these remarks, delivered with great majesty and grandeur, Mr. Dombey had truly revealed the secret feelings of his breast, and indescribable distrust of anybody stepping in between himself and his son, a haughty dread of having any rival or partner in the boy's respect and deference, a sharp misgiving recently acquired that he was not infallible in his power of bending and binding human wills, as sharper jealousy of any second check across. These were at that time the master keys of his soul. In all of his life he had never made a friend. His cold and distant nature had neither sought one nor found one, and now, when that nature concentrated its whole force so strongly on a partial scheme of parental interest and ambition, it seemed as if its icy current, instead of being released by this influence and running clear and free, had thawed for but an instant to admit its burden, and then frozen with it into one unyielding block, elevated thus to the godmotherhood of little Paul in virtue of her insignificance. Miss Tox was from that hour chosen and appointed to office, and Mr. Dombey further signified his pleasure that the ceremony, already long delayed, should take place without further postponement. His sister, who had been far from anticipating so signal a success, withdrew as soon as she could to communicate it to her best of friends, and Mr. Dombey was left alone in his library. He had already laid his hand upon the bell rope to convey his usual summons to Richards, when his eye fell upon a writing desk belonging to his deceased wife, which had been taken among other things from a cabinet in her chamber. It was not the first time that his eye had lighted on it. He carried the key in his pocket, and he brought it to his table and opened it now, having previously locked the room door with a well-accustomed hand. From beneath a leaf of torn and cancelled scraps of paper he took one letter that remained entire, involuntarily holding his breath as he opened this document, and bating in the stealthy action something of his arrogant demeanor, he sat down, resting his head upon one hand, and read it through. He read it slowly and attentively, and with a nice peculiarity to every syllable. Otherwise than as his great deliberation seemed unnatural, and perhaps the result of an effort equally great, he allowed no sign of emotion to escape him when he had read it through. He folded and refolded it slowly several times and tore it carefully into fragments. Checking his hand in the act of throwing these away, he put them in his pocket as if unwilling to trust them even to the chances of being reunited and deciphered. And instead of ringing as usual for little Paul, he sat solitary all the evening in his cheerless room. There was anything but solitude in the nursery, for their Mrs. Chick and Miss Tox were enjoying a social evening, so much to the disgust of Miss Susan Nipper that young lady embraced every opportunity of making wry faces behind the door. Her feelings were so much excited on the occasion that she found it indispensable to afford them this relief even without having the comfort of any audience or sympathy whatever, as the knights errants of old relieved their minds by carving their mistresses' names in deserts and wildernesses and other savage places where there was no probability of there ever being anybody. 2. Read them. So did Miss Susan Nipper curl her snubbed nose into drawers and wardrobes, put away winks of disparagement in cupboards, shed derisive squints into stone pictures, and contradict and call names out in the passage that to interlopers, however, blissfully unconscious of the young lady's sentiments, saw little Paul safe through all the stages of undressing, airy exercise, supper, and bed, and then sat down to tea. Before the fire the two children now lay through the good offices of Polly in one room, and it was not until the ladies were established at their tea table that, happening to look towards the little beds, they thought of Florence. "How sound she sleeps," said Miss Tokes. "Why, you know, my dear, she takes a great deal of exercise in the course of the day," returned Mrs. Skick, playing about little Paul. "So much she is a curious child," said Miss Tokes. "My dear," retorted Mrs. Chick in a low voice. "Her mamma all over." "Indeed," said Miss Tokes. "Ah, dear me," a tone of most extraordinary compassion. Miss Tokes said it in, though she had no distinct idea why, except that it was expected of her. "Florence will never, never, never be a tomb," said Mrs. Cobb. "Not if she lives to be 1,000 years old." Miss Tokes elevated her eyebrows and was again full of commiseration. "I quite fret and worry myself about her," said Mrs. Chick with a sigh of modest merit. "I really don't see what is to become of her when she grows older, or what position she is to take. She don't gain on her Papa in the least. How can one expect she should when she's so very unlike a tomboy?" Miss Tokes looked as if she saw no way out of such a cogent argument as that at all. "And the child, you see," said Mrs. Chick in deep confidence, "has poor dear Fanny's nature. She never make an effort in afterlife. I'll venture to say never. She never wind and twine herself about her papa's heart like the ivy," suggested Miss Tokes. "Like the ivy," Mrs. Trick assented. "Never, she never glide and nestle into the bosom of her papa's affection." "Like the startled fawn," suggested Miss Tokes. "Like the startled fawn," said Mrs. Chick. "Never, poor Fanny. Yet how I loved her." "You must not distress yourself, my dear," said Miss Tokes in a soothing voice. "Now really you have too much feeling. We have all our faults," said Mrs. Chick, weeping and shaking her head. "I dare say we have. I never was blind to hers. I never said I was far from it. Yet how I loved her. What a satisfaction it was to Mrs. Chick. A commonplace piece of folly enough compared with whom her sister-in-law had been a very angel of womanly intelligence and gentleness to patronize and be tender to the memory of that lady in exact pursuance of her conduct to her in her lifetime, and to thoroughly believe herself and take herself in and make herself uncommonly comfortable on the strength of her toleration. What a mighty pleasant virtue tolerance should be when we are right, to be so very pleasant when we are wrong, and quite unable to demonstrate how we come to be invested with the privilege of exercising it." Mrs. Chick was yet drying her eyes and shaking her head when Richards made bold to caution her that Miss Florence was awake and sitting in her bed. She had risen, as the nurse said, and the lashes of her eyes were wet with tears, but no one saw them glistening save Polly. No one else leant over her and whispered soothing words to her, or was near enough to hear the flutter of her beating heart. "Oh, dear nurse," said the child, looking earnestly up in her face, "let me lie by my brother." "Why, my pet," said Richards. "Oh, I think he loves me," cried the child wildly. "Let me lie by him, pray do." Mrs. Chick interposed with some motherly words about going to sleep like a dear, but Florence repeated her supplication with a frightened look and in a voice broken by sobs and tears. "I'll not wake him," she said, covering her face and hanging down her head. "I'll only touch him with my hand and go to sleep. Oh, pray, pray let me lie by my brother tonight, for I believe he is fond of me." Richards took her without a word, and carrying her to the little bed in which the infant was sleeping, laid her down by his side. She crept as near him as she could without disturbing his rest, and stretching out one arm so that it timidly embraced his neck, and hiding her face on the other, over which her damp and scattered hair fell loose, lay motionless. "Poor little thing," said Miss Tokes. "She has been dreaming, I dare say, dreaming perhaps of loving tones, forever silent, of loving eyes, forever closed, of loving arms again wound round her, and relaxing in that dream within the dream, which no tongue can relate, seeking perhaps in dreams some natural comfort for A heart deeply and sorely wounded though so young a child's, and finding it perhaps in dreams, if not in waking cold substantial truth, this trivial incident had so interrupted the current of conversation that it was difficult of resumption, and Mrs. Chick moreover had been so affected by the contemplation of her own tolerant nature that she was not in spirits. The two friends accordingly soon made an end of their tea, and a servant was dispatched to fetch a hackney cabriolet. For Miss Tox had great experience in hackney cabs, and her starting in one was generally a work of time, as she was systematic in the preparatory arrangements. "Have the goodness, if you please, Tollinson," said Miss Tox, "first of all to carry out a pen and ink, and take his number legibly." "Yes, miss," said Tallinson. "Then if you please, Tallinson," said Miss Tox, "have the goodness to turn the cushion," which said Miss Tox apart to Mrs. Chuck is generally damp, my dear. "Yes, miss," said Tallinson. "I'll trouble you also, if you please, Harrison," said Miss Tox, "with this card, and this shilling he's to drive to the card, and is to understand that he will not on any account have more than the shilling." "No, miss," said Tarlinson, "and I'm sorry to give you so much trouble, Tarlinson," said Miss Tox, looking at him pensively. "Not at all, miss," said Tarlinson. "Mention to the man then, if you please, Harrison," said Miss Tox, "that the lady's uncle is a magistrate, and that if he gives her any of his impertinence, he will be punished terribly. You can pretend to say that, if you please, Harrison, in a friendly way, and because you know it was done to another man who died." "Certainly, miss," said Harrison. "And now good night to my sweet, sweet, sweet godson," said Miss Tox, with a soft shower of kisses at each repetition of the adjective. "And Louisa, my dear friend, promise me to take a little something warm before you go to bed, and not to distress yourself." It was with extreme difficulty that Nipper the black-eyed, who looked on steadfastly, contained herself at this crisis, and until the subsequent departure of Mrs. Chick. But the nursery being free at length of visitors, she made herself some recompense for her late restraint. "You might keep me in a straight skirt for 6 weeks," said Nipper, "and when I got it off I'd only be more aggravated." "Whoever heard the like of them?" to Griffin's Mrs. Richards. "And then to talk of having been dreaming, poor dear," said Polly. "Oh, you beauties," cried Susan Nipper, affecting to salute the door, by which the ladies had departed. "Never be a dumby, won't she, Mr. Bioche? Won't we? Don't want any more such ones. Enough. Don't wake the children." "Susan dear," said Polly, "I'm very much beholden to you, Mrs. Richards," said Susan, who was not by any means discriminating in her wrath, "and really feel it as honor to receive your commands, being a black slave and a mulatto." "Mrs. Richards, if there's any other orders you can give me, pray mention them." "Nonsense orders," said Polly. "Oh, bless your heart, Mrs. Richards," cried Susan. "Temporaries always orders permanencies here. Didn't you know that? Why, wherever was you born, Mrs. Richards?" "But wherever you was born, Mrs. Richards," pursued Spedfire, shaking her head resolutely, "and whenever and however, which is best known to yourself, you may bear in mind, please, that it's one thing to give orders and quite another thing to take them. A person may tell a person to dive off a bridge head foremost into 45 feet of water, Mrs. Richards, but a person may be a very far from diving there." "Now," said Polly, "you're angry because you're a good little thing and fond of Miss Florence, and yet you turn round on me because there's nobody else. It's very easy for some to keep their tempers and be soft-spoken, Mrs. Richards," returned Susan, slightly mollified, "when the child's made as much of as a prince, and is petted and patted till it wishes its friends further. But when a sweet young pretty innocent that never ought to have a cross word spoken to or of it is run down, the case is very different indeed." "My goodness gracious me, Miss Floy, you naughty sinful child, if you don't shut your eyes this minute I'll call in them hobgoblins that lives in the clock to come and eat you up alive." Here Miss Nipper made a horrible lowing, supposed to issue from a conscientious goblin of the bull species, impatient to discharge the severe duty of his position, having further composed her young charge by covering her head with the bedclothes and making 3 or 4 angry dabs at the pillow. She folded her arms and screwed up her mouth and sat looking at the fire for the rest of the evening. Though little Paul was set in nursery phrase to take a deal of notice for his age, he took as little notice of all this as of the preparations for his christening on the next day, but one which nevertheless went on about him as to his personal apparel, and that of his sister and the 2 nurses, with great activity. Neither did he, on the arrival of the appointed morning show, any sense of its importance, being on the contrary unusually inclined to sleep and unusually inclined to take it ill in his attendance, that they dressed him. To go out it happened to be an iron-gray autumnal day, with a shrewd east wind blowing a day in keeping with the proceedings. Mr. Dombey represented in himself the wind, the shade, and the autumn of the christening he stood in his library to receive. The company as hard and cold as the weather, and when he looked out through the glass room at the trees in the little garden, their brown and yellow leaves came fluttering down as if he blighted them. Oof, they were black cold rooms and seemed to be in mourning like the inmates of the house. The books precisely matched as to size and drawn up in line, like soldiers looked in their cold, hard, slippery uniforms, as if they had but one idea among them, and that was a freezer. The bookcase glazed and locked repudiated all familiarities. Mr. Pitt in bronze on the top, with no trace of his celestial origin about him, guarded the unattainable treasure like an enchanted moor. A dusty urn at each high corner dug up from an ancient tomb preached desolation and decay as from the pulpit, and the chimney glass reflecting Mr. Dombey and his portrait at one blow seemed fraught with melancholy meditations. The stiff and stark fire irons appeared to claim a nearer relationship than anything else there to Mr. Dombey, with his button coat, his white cravat, his heavy gold watch chain, and his creaking boots. But this was before the arrival of Mr. and Mrs. Check, his lawful relatives, who soon presented themselves. "My dear Paul," Mrs. Check murmured as she embraced him. "The beginning, I hope, of many joyful days." "Thank you, Louisa," said Mr. Dombey grimly. "How do you do, Mr. John?" "How do you do, sir," said Check. He gave Mr. Toomey his hand as if he feared it might electrify him. Mr. Toomey took it as if it were a fish or seaweed or some such clammy substance, and immediately returned it to him with exalted politeness. "Perhaps, Louisa," said Mr. Dombey, slightly turning his head in his cravat, "as if it were a socket, you would have preferred a fire." "Oh, my dear Pauline," said Mrs. Chick, who had much ado to keep her teeth from chattering. "Not for me, Mr. John," said Mr. Dombey. "You are not sensible of any chill." Mr. John, who had already got both his hands in his pockets over the wrists, and was on the very threshold of that same canine chorus which had given Mrs. Chick so much offense on a former occasion, protested that he was perfectly comfortable. He added in a low voice, "with my tittle tattle-roo," when he was providentially stopped by Tallinson, who announced Miss Talks, and entered that fair enslaver with a blue nose and indescribably frosty face, referable to her being very thinly clad in a maze of fluttering odds and ends to do honor to the ceremony. "How do you do, Miss Tokes?" said Mr. Dombey. Miss Tokes, in the midst of her spreading gauzes, went down altogether like an opera glass shutting up. She curtsied so low in acknowledgement of Mr. Dombey's advancing a step or to meet her. "I can never forget this occasion," said Miss Tokes softly. "'Tis impossible, my dear Louise. I can hardly believe the evidence of my senses." If Miss Stokes could believe the evidence of one of her senses, it was a very cold day. That was quite clear. She took an early opportunity of promoting the circulation in the tip of her nose by secretly chafing it with her pocket handkerchief, lest by its very low temperature it should disagreeably astonish the baby when she came to kiss it. The baby soon appeared, carried in great glory by Richards, while Florence, in custody of that active young constable Susan Nipper, brought up the rear, though the whole nursery party were dressed by this time in lighter mourning than at first. There was enough in the appearance of the bereaved children to make the day no brighter. The baby, too, it might have been Miss Tox's nose, began to cry, thereby, as it happened, preventing Mr. Chick from the awkward fulfillment of a very honest purpose he had, which was to make much of Florence for this gentleman, insensible to the superior claims of a perfect Dombey, perhaps on account of having the honor to be united to a Dombey himself, and being familiar with excellence, really liked her, and showed that he liked her, and was about to show it in his own way now, when Paul cried, and his helpmate stopped him short. "Now, Florence, child," said her aunt briskly, "what are you doing, love? Show yourself to him. Engage his attention, my dear." The atmosphere became, or might have become, colder and colder when Mr. Dombey stood frigidly watching his little daughter, who, clapping her hands and standing on tiptoe before the throne of his son, and ere lured him to bend down from his highest state and look at her. Some honest act of Richard's may have aided the effect, but he did look down and held his peace as his sister hid behind her nurse. He followed her with his eyes, and when she peeped out with a merry cry to him, he sprang up and crowed lustily, laughing outright, when she ran in upon him and seeming to fondle her curls with his tiny hands while she smothered him with kisses. Was Mr. Dobby pleased to see this? He testified no pleasure by the relaxation of a nerve, but outward tokens of any kind of feeling were unusual with him. If any sunbeam stole into the room to light the children at their play, it never reached his face. He looked on so fixedly and coldly that the warm light vanished even from the laughing eyes of little Florence. When at last they happened to meet his, it was a dull gray autumn day indeed, and in a minute's pause and silence that took place the leaves fell sorrowfully. "Mr. John," said Mr. Dobby, referring to his watch and assuming his hat and gloves, "take my sister, if you please. My arm today is Miss Tox's. You had better go first with Master Paul Richards. Be very careful in Mr. Dombey's carriage. Dombey and son, Miss Tox, Mrs. Chick Richards, and Florence in a little carriage following it. Susan Nipper and the owner, Mr. Chick." Susan, looking out of the window without intermission, as a relief from the embarrassment of confronting the large face of that gentleman, and thinking whenever anything rattled that he was putting up in paper an appropriate pecuniary compliment for herself. Once upon the road to church, Mr. Dombey clapped his hands for the amusement of his son, at which instance of parental enthusiasm Miss Tox was enchanted. But exclusive of this incident, the chief difference between the christening party and a party in a mourning coach consisted in the colors of the carriage and horses. Arrived at the church steps, they were received by a portentous beadle, Mr. Dombey dismounting first to help the ladies out, and standing near him at the church door looked like another beadle, a beadle less gorgeous but more dreadful, the beadle of private life, the beadle of our business and our bosoms. Miss Tox's hand trembled as she slipped it through Mr. Dombey's arm and felt herself escorted up the steps, preceded by a cocked hat and a Babylonian collar. It seemed for a moment like that other solemn institution. "Wilt thou have this man, Lucretia?" "Yes, I will please to bring the child and quick out of the air," there whispered the beadle, holding open the inner door of the church. Little Paul might have asked with Hamlet, "Into my grave." So chill and earthy was the place, the tall shrouded pulpit and reading desk, the dreary perspective of empty pews stretching away under the galleries, and empty benches mounting to the roof and lost in the shadow of the great grim organ, the dusty matting and cold stone slabs, the grisly free seats in the aisles, and the damp corner by the bell rope where the black trestles used for funerals were stowed away, along with some shovels and baskets and a coil or two of deadly-looking rope. The strange, unusual, uncomfortable smell and the cadaverous light were all in unison. It was a cold and dismal scene. "There's a wedding just on, sir," said the beadle, "but it'll be over directly if you will walk into the vestry." Before he turned again to lead the way, he gave Mr. Dobby a bow and a half-smile of recognition, importing that he, the beadle, remembered to have had the pleasure of attending on him when he buried his wife, and hoped he had enjoyed himself, since the very wedding looked dismal. As they passed in front of the altar, the bride was too old, and the bridegroom too young, and a superannuated bow with one eye and an eyeglass stuck in its blank companion was giving away the lady, while the friends were shivering in the vestry. The fire was smoking, and an overaged and overworked and underpaid attorney's clerk making a search was running his forefinger down the parchment pages of an immense register, one of a long series of similar volumes gorged with burials. Over the fireplace was a ground plan of the vaults underneath the church, and Mr. Chick, skimming the literary portion of it aloud by waving, livening the company, read the reference to Mrs. Dobby's tomb in full before he could stop himself. After another cold interval, a wheezy little pew opener, afflicted with an asthma appropriate to the churchyard if not to the church, summoned them to the font, a rigid marble basin which seemed to have been playing a churchyard game at cup and ball with its matter-of-fact pedestal, and to have been just that moment caught on the top of it. Here they waited some little time while the marriage party unrolled themselves, and meanwhile the wheezy little pew opener, partly in consequence of her infirmity and partly that the marriage party might not forget her, went about the building, coughing like a grampus. Presently the clerk, the only cheerful-looking object there, and he was an undertaker, came up with a jug of warm water and said something as he poured it into the font about taking the chill off which millions of gallons boiling hot could not have done for the occasion. Then the clergyman, unamiable and mild-looking young curate, but obviously afraid of the baby, appeared like the principal character in a ghost story, a tall figure all in white, at sight of whom Paul rent the air with his cries and never left off again, till he was taken out black in the face. Even when that event had happened, to the great relief of everybody, he was heard under the portico during the rest of the ceremony, now fainter, now louder, now hushed, now bursting forth again with an irrepressible sense of his wrongs. This so distracted the attention of the two ladies that Mrs. Chick was constantly deploying into the center aisle to send out messages by the pew opener, while Miss Tokes kept her prayer book open at the gunpowder plot and occasionally read responses from that service. During the whole of these proceedings, Mr. Dobby remained as impassive and gentlemanly as ever, and perhaps assisted in making it so cold that the young curate smoked at the mouth as he read. The only time that he unbent his visage in the least was when the clergyman, in delivering very unaffected and simply the closing exhortation relative to the future examination of the child by the sponsors, happened to rest his eye on Mr. Chick, and then Mr. Dombey might have been seen to express by a majestic look that he would like to catch him at it. It might have been well for Mr. Dobby if he had thought of his own dignity a little less, and had thought of the great origin and purpose of the ceremony, in which he took so formal and so stiff a part a little more. His arrogance contrasted strangely with its history. When it was all over, he again gave his arm to Miss Tokes and conducted her to the vestry, where he informed the clergyman how much pleasure it would have given him to have solicited the honor of his company at dinner, but for the unfortunate state of his household affairs, the register signed and the fees paid, and the pew opener, whose cough was very bad, again remembered, and the beadle gratified, and the sexton, who was accidentally on the doorsteps looking with great interest at the weather, not forgotten. They got into the carriage again and drove home in the same bleak fellowship that they found Mr. Pitt turning up his nose at a cold collation set forth in a cold pump of glass and silver, and looking more like a dead dinner lying in state than a social refreshment. On their arrival, Miss Tokes produced a mug for her godson, and Mr. Chick a knife and fork and spoon. In a case, Mr. Dombey also produced a bracelet for Miss Tokes, and on the receipt of this token, Miss Tokes was tenderly affected. "Mr. John," said Mr. Dombey, "will you take the bottom of the table, if you please?" "What have you got there, Mr. John?" "I have got a cold village of veal here, sir," replied Mr. Chick, rubbing his numbed hands hard together. "What have you got there, sir?" "This," returned Mr. Dombey, "is some cold preparation of calf's head. I think I see cold fowls, hams, patties, salad, lobster." "Miss Tokes will do me the honor of taking some wine champagne." To Miss Tokes there was a toothache in everything. The wine was so bitter cold that it forced a little scream from Miss Tokes, which she had great difficulty in turning into a hum. The veal had come from such an airy pantry that the first taste of it had struck a sensation as of cold lead to Mr. Chick's extremities. Mr. Dombey alone remained unmoved. He might have been hung up for sale at a Russian fair as a specimen of a frozen gentleman. The prevailing influence was too much even for his sister. She made no effort at flattery or small talk, and directed all her efforts to looking as warm as she could. "Well, sir," said Mr. Chick, making a desperate plunge after a long silence, and filling a glass of sherry, "I shall drink this, if you'll allow me, sir, to little Paul." "Bless him," murmured Miss Tokes, taking a sip of wine. "Dear little Dobby," murmured Mrs. Chick. "Mr. John," said Mr. Dobby with severe gravity, "my son would feel and express himself obliged to you. I have no doubt if he could appreciate the favor you have done him, he will prove in time to come, I trust, equal to any responsibility that the obliging disposition of his relations and friends in private, or the onerous nature of our position in public, may impose upon him." The tone in which this was said admitting of nothing more, Mr. Chick relapsed into low spirits and silence. Not so Miss Tokes, who, having listened to Mr. Dombey with even a more emphatic attention than usual, and with a more expressive tendency of her head to one side, now leaned across the table and said to Mrs. Chick softly, "Louisa, my dear," said Mrs. Chick, "onerous nature of our position in public, may I have forgotten the exact term, expose him to," said Mrs. Chick. "Pardon me, my dear," returned Miss Tokes, "I think not. It was more rounded and flowing, obliging disposition of relations and friends in private, or onerous nature of position in public, may impose upon him." "Impose upon him, to be sure," said Mrs. Chick. Miss Tokes struck her delicate hands together lightly in triumph, and added, casting up her eyes, eloquence indeed. Mr. Dombey, in the meanwhile, had issued orders for the attendance of Richards, who now entered curtsying, but without the baby Paul being asleep. After the fatigues of the morning, Mr. Dombey, having delivered a glass of wine to this vase, addressed her in the following words, and Miss Tox, previously settling a head on one side and making other little arrangements for engraving them on her heart during the 6 months or so, Richards, which have seen you an inmate of this house, you have done your duty, desiring to connect some little service to you. With this occasion I considered how I could best effect that object, and I also advised with my sister Mrs. Trick, interposed the gentleman of that name. Oh, hush, if you please, said Miss Tox. I was about to say to you, Richards, resumed Mr. Dombey, with an appalling glance at Mr. John, that I was further assisted in my decision by the recollection of a conversation I held with your husband in this room on the occasion of your being hired, when he disclosed to me the melancholy fact that your family himself at the head was sunk and steeped in ignorance. Richards quailed under the magnificence of the reproof. I am far from being friendly, pursued Mr. Dombey, to what is called by persons of leveling sentiments general education, but it is necessary that the inferior classes should continue to be taught to know their position and to conduct themselves properly. So far I approve of schools having the power of nominating a child on the foundation of an ancient establishment called from a worshipful company the charitable grinders, where not only is a wholesome education bestowed upon the scholars, but where a dress and badge is likewise provided for them. I have first, communicating through Mrs. Chick with your family, nominated your eldest son to an existing vacancy, and he has this day, I am informed, assumed the habit. The number of her son, I believe, said Mr. Dombey, turning to his sister and speaking of the child as if he were a hackney coach, is 147. Louisa, you can tell her 147, said Mrs. Chick. The dress, Richards, is a nice warm blue blazetailed coat and cap turned up with orange colored binding, red worsted stockings, and very strong leather small clothes. One might wear the articles oneself, said Mrs. Chick with enthusiasm, and be grateful there. Richards, said Miss Tox, now indeed you may be proud. The charitable grinders, I'm sure I'm very much obliged, sir, returned Richards faintly, and take it very kind that you should remember my little ones. At the same time a vision of Byler as a charitable grinder, with his very small legs encased in the serviceable clothing described by Mrs. Chick, swam before Richard's eyes and made them water. I'm very glad to see you have so much feeling, Richards, said Miss Tox. It makes one almost hope it really does, said Mrs. Chick, who prided herself on taking trustful views of human nature, that there may be yet some faint spark of gratitude and right feeling in the world. Richards deferred to these compliments by curtsying and murmuring her thanks, but finding it quite impossible to recover her spirits from the disorder into which they had been thrown by the image of her son in his precocious nether garments, she gradually approached the door and was heartily relieved to escape by it such temporary indications of a partial thaw that had appeared with her vanished with her, and the frost set in again, as cold and hard as ever. Mr. Chick was twice heard to hum a tune at the bottom of the table, but on both occasions it was a fragment of the Dead March in Soul. The party seemed to get colder and colder, and to be gradually resolving itself into a congealed and solid state, like the collection round which it was assembled. At length Mrs. Chick looked at Miss Tox, and Miss Tox returned the look, and they both rose and said it was really time to go. Mr. Dombey, receiving this announcement with perfect equanimity, they took leave of that gentleman and presently departed under the protection of Mr. Chick, who, when they had turned their backs upon the house and left its master in its usual solitary state, put his hands in his pockets, threw himself back in the carriage, and whistled with a hey-ho chevy all through, conveying into his face as he did so an expression of such gloomy and terrible defiance that Mrs. Chick dared not protest or in any way molest him. Richards, though she had little Paul on her lap, could not forget her own firstborn. She felt it was ungrateful, but the influence of the day fell even on the charitable grinders, and she could hardly help regarding his pewter badge, no, 147, as somehow a part of its formality and sternness. She spoke to in the nursery of his blessed legs, and was again troubled by his spectre in uniform. I don't know what I wouldn't give, said Polly, to see the poor little dear, before he gets used to him, why then I'll tell you what Mrs. Richards retorted. Nipper, who had been admitted to her confidence, see him, and make your mind easy, Mr. Dobby wouldn't like it, said Polly. Oh, wouldn't he, Mrs. Richards retorted Nipper. He'd like it very much, I think. When he was asked, you wouldn't ask him, I suppose, at all, said Polly. No, Mrs. Richards, quite contrary, returned Susan. And them to inspector's talks, and Chick not intending to be on duty. Tomorrow, as I heard him say me, and Miss Floy will go along with you tomorrow morning, and welcome Mrs. Richards, if you like, for we may as well walk there as up and down a street, and better too. Polly rejected the idea pretty stoutly at first, but by little and little she began to entertain it, as she entertained more and more distinctly the forbidden pictures of her children, and her home. At length, arguing that there could be no great harm in calling for a moment at the door, she yielded to the Nipper proposition. The matter being settled thus, little Paul began to cry most piteously, as if he had a foreboding that no good would come of it. What's the matter with the child, asked Susan. He's cold, I think, said Polly, walking with him to and fro and hushing him. It was a bleak autumnal afternoon indeed, and as she walked and hushed and glancing through the dreary windows, pressed the little fellow closer to her breast, the withered leaves came showering down. Chapter 6. Paul's second deprivation. Polly was beset with so many misgivings in the morning that but for the incessant promptings of her black-eyed companion, she would have abandoned all thoughts of the expedition and formally petitioned for leave to see No. 147 under the awful shadow of Mr. Dombey's roof. But Susan, who was personally disposed in favor of the excursion, and who, like Tony Lumpkin, if she could bear the disappointments of other people with tolerable fortitude, could not abide to disappoint herself, threw so many ingenious doubts in the way of this second thought, and stimulated the original intention with so many ingenious arguments, that almost as soon as Mr. Daubney's stately back was turned, and that gentleman was pursuing his daily road towards the city, his unconscious son was on his way to Stagg's Gardens. This euphonious locality was situated in a suburb known by the inhabitants of Stagg's Gardens by the name of Campbelltown, a designation which the stranger's map of London, as printed with a view to pleasant and commodious reference on pocket handkerchiefs, condenses, with some show of reason, into Camden Town. Hither the two nurses bent their steps, accompanied by their charges, Richards carrying Paul, of course, and Susan leading little Florence by the hand and giving her such jerks and pokes from time to time as she considered it wholesome to administer. The first shock of a great earthquake had just at that period rent the whole neighborhood to its center. Traces of its course were visible on every side. Houses were knocked down, streets broken through, and stopped, deep pits and trenches dug in the ground, enormous heaps of earth and clay thrown up, buildings that were undermined and shaking, propped by great beams of wood. Here a chaos of carts overthrown and jumbled together lay topsy-turvy at the bottom of a steep, unnatural hill, their confused treasures of iron soaked and rusted in something that had accidentally become a pond. Everywhere were bridges that were thoroughfares that were wholly impossible, Babel towers of chimneys wanting half their height, temporary wooden houses and enclosures in the most unlikely situations, carcasses of ragged tenements and fragments of unfinished walls and arches and piles of scaffolding and wildernesses of bricks and giant forms of cranes and tripods straddling above nothing. There were 100 shapes and substances of incompleteness wildly mingled out of their places, upside down, burrowing into the earth, aspiring in the air, moldering in the water, and unintelligible as any dream. Hot springs and fiery eruptions, the usual attendants upon earthquakes, lend their contributions of confusion to the scene. Boiling water hissed and heaved within dilapidated walls, whence also the glare and roar of flames came issuing forth, and mounds of ashes blocked up rights of way, and wholly changed the law and custom of the neighborhood. In short, the yet unfinished and unopened railroad was in progress, and from the very core of all this dire disorder trailed smoothly away upon its mighty course of civilization and improvement. But as yet the neighborhood was shy to own the railroad. One or two bold speculators had projected streets, and one had built a little, but had stopped among the modern ashes to consider farther of it. A brand new tavern, redundant of fresh mortar and size, and fronting nothing at all, had taken for its sign the railway arms. But that might be rash enterprise, and then it hoped to sell drink to the workmen. So the excavator's house of call had sprung up from a beer shop, and the old established ham and beef shop had become the railway eating house with a roast leg of pork daily. Through interested motives of a similar immediate and popular description, lodging housekeepers were favorable in like manner, and for the like reasons were not to be trusted. The general belief was very slow. There were frowsy fields and cowhouses, and dung hills and dust heaps and ditches and gardens, and summer houses and carpet-beating grounds at the very door of the railway. Little tumuli of oyster shells in the oyster season, and of lobster shells in the lobster season, and of broken crockery and faded cabbage leaves in all seasons encroached upon its high places. Posts and rails and old cautions to trespassers and backs of mean houses and patches of wretched vegetation stared it out of countenance. Nothing was the better for it, or thought of being so. If the miserable wasteland lying near it could have laughed, it would have laughed it to scorn. Like many of the miserable neighbors, Staggsy's Gardens was uncommonly incredulous. It was a little row of houses with little squalid patches of ground before them, fenced off with old doors, barrel staves, scraps of tarpaulin, and dead bush with bottomless tin kettles and exhausted iron fenders thrust into the gaps. Here the Stags' Gardens trained scarlet beans, kept fowls, and rabbits, erected rotten summer houses. One was an old boat, dried clothes, and smoked pipes. Some are of opinion that Stags' Gardens derived its name from a deceased capitalist, one Mr. Staggs, who had built it for his delectation. Others, who had a natural taste for the country, held that it dated from those rural times when the antlered herd, under the familiar denomination of Stagses, had resorted to its shady precincts. Be this as it may, Staggsy's Gardens was regarded by its population as a sacred grove, not to be withered by railroads, and so confident were they generally of its long outliving any such ridiculous inventions that the master chimney sweeper at the corner, who was understood to take the lead in the local politics of the Gardens, had publicly declared that on the occasion of the railroad opening, if ever it did open, 2 of his boys should ascend the flues of his dwelling with instructions to hail the failure with derisive cheers from the chimney pots. To this unhallowed spot, the very name of which had hitherto been carefully concealed from Mr. Dombey by his sister, was little Paul now borne by fate. And Richards, "That's my house, Susan," said Polly, pointing it out. "Is it indeed, Mrs. Richards?" said Susan condescendingly. "And there's my sister Jemima at the door, I do declare," cried Polly, "with my own sweet precious baby in our arms." The sight added such an extensive pair of wings to Polly's impatience that she set off down the gardens at a run, and, bouncing on Jemima, changed babies with her in a twinkling, to the unutterable astonishment of that young damsel, on whom the air of the dandies seemed to have fallen from the clouds. "Why, Polly," cried Jemima, "you, what a turn you have given me! Who would have thought it? Come along in, Polly. How well you do look, to be sure. The children will go half wild to see you, Polly. That they will, that they did, if one might judge from the noise they made, and the way in which they dashed at Polly and dragged her to a low chair in the chimney corner, where her own honest apple face became immediately the center of a bunch of smaller pippins, all laying their rosy cheeks close to it, and all evidently the growth of the same tree. As to Polly, she was full, as noisy and vehement as the children, and it was not until she was quite out of breath, and her hair was hanging all about her flushed face, and her new christening attire was very much disheveled, that any pause took place in the confusion. Even then the smallest Tootle but one remained in her lap, holding on tight with both arms round her neck, while the smallest Tootle but two mounted on the back of the chair and made desperate efforts with one leg in the air to kiss her round the corner. "Look, there's a pretty little lady come to see you," said Polly, "and see how quiet she is. What a beautiful little lady, ain't she?" This reference to Florence, who had been standing by the door, not observant of what passed, directed the attention of the younger branches towards her, and had likewise the happy effect of leading to the formal recognition of Miss Snipper, who was not quite free from a misgiving that she had been already slighted. "Oh, do come in and sit down a minute, Susan, please," said Polly. "This is my sister Jemima. This is Jemima. I don't know what I should ever do with myself. If it wasn't for Susan Nipper, I shouldn't be here now. But for her, oh, do sit down, Miss Snipper, if you please," quoth Jemima. Susan took the extreme corner of a chair with a stately and ceremonious aspect. "I never was so glad to see anybody in all my life. Now, really, I never was, Miss Snipper," said Jemima. Susan, relaxing, took a little more of the chair and smiled graciously. "Do untie your bonnet strings, "And make yourself at home, Miss Snipper, please," entreated Jemima. "I'm afraid it's a poorer place than you're used to, but you'll make allowances." I'm sure the black-eyed was so softened by this deferential behavior that she caught up little Miss Tootle, who was running past, and took her to Banbury Cross immediately. "But where's my pretty boy?" said Polly. "My poor fellow, I came all this way to see him in his new clothes." "Oh, what a pity," cried Jemima. "He'll break his heart when he hears his mother's." "Then here he's at school." "Polly, gone already?" "Yes, he went for the first time yesterday for fear he should lose any learning. But it's half holiday, Polly. If you could only stop till he comes home, you and Miss Snipper leastways," said Jemima, mindful. "And good time of the dignity of the black-eyed." "And how does he look, Jemima?" "Bless him," faltered Polly. "Well, really, he don't look so bad as you'd suppose," returned Jemima. "Oh," said Polly, with emotion, "I knew his legs must be too short." "His legs is short," returned Jemima, "especially behind. But they'll get longer, Polly, every day." It was a slow perspective kind of consolation, but the cheerfulness and good nature with which it was administered gave it a value it did not intrinsically possess. After a moment's silence, Polly asked in a more sprightly manner, "And where's Father D. mind, my dear?" For by that patriarchal appellation Mr. Tootle was generally known in the family. "There again," said Jemima. "What a pity Father took his dinner with him this morning and isn't coming home till night. But he's always talking of you, Polly, and telling the children about you. And he's the peaceablest, patientest, best-temperedest soul in the world, as he always was, and will be thanked." "The Jemima," cried the simple Polly, delighted by the speech and disappointed by the absence. "Oh, you needn't thank me, Polly," said her sister, giving her a sounding kiss upon the cheek, and then dancing little Paul cheerfully. "I say the same of you sometimes, and think it too." In spite of the double disappointment, it was impossible to regard in the light of a failure a visit which was greeted with such a reception. So the sisters talked hopefully about family matters, and about Billy, and about all of his brothers and sisters, while the black-eyed, having performed several journeys to Banbury Cross and back, took sharp note of the furniture, the Dutch clock, the cupboard, the castle on the mantelpiece, with red and green windows in it susceptible of illumination by a candle, and within, and a pair of small black velvet kittens, each with a lady's reticule in its mouth, regarded by the Staggs's gardeners as prodigies of imitative art. The conversation soon becoming general, lest the black-eyed should go off at score and turn sarcastic, that young lady related to Jemima a summary of everything she knew concerning Mr. Dombey, his prospects, family pursuits, and character, also an exact inventory of her personal wardrobe, and some account of her principal relations and friends. Having relieved her mind of these disclosures, she partook of shrimps and porter, and evinced a disposition to swear eternal friendship. Little Florence herself was not behindhand in improving the occasion, for being conducted forth by the young Tootles to inspect some toadstools and other curiosities of the gardens, she entered with them heart and soul on the formation of a temporary breakwater across a small green pool that had collected in a corner. She was still busily engaged in that labor when sought and found by Susan, who, such was her sense of duty, even under the humanizing influence of shrimps, delivered a moral address to her, punctuated with thumbs on her degenerate nature while washing her face and hands, and predicted that she would bring the gray hairs of her family in general with sorrow to the grave, after some delay occasioned by a pretty long confidential interview above stairs on pecuniary subjects between Polly and Jemima. An interchange of babies was again effected, for Polly had all this time retained her own child and Jemima little Paul, and the visitors took leave. But first the young Tootles, victims of a pious fraud, were deluded into repairing in a body to a chandler's shop in the neighborhood, for the ostensible purpose of spending a penny, and when the coast was quite clear, Polly fled, Jemima calling after her that if they could only go round towards the city road on their way back, they would be sure to meet little Billy coming from school. "Do you think that we might take time to go a little round in that direction?" Susan inquired Polly, when they halted to take breath. "Why not, Mrs. Richards?" returned Susan. "It's getting on towards our dinner time, you know," said Polly, but lunch had rendered her companion more than indifferent to this grave consideration, so she allowed no weight to it, and they resolved to go a little round. Now it happened that poor Baylor's life had been since yesterday morning rendered weary by the costume of the charitable grinders. The youth of the streets could not endure it. No young vagabond could be brought to bear its contemplation for a moment. without throwing himself upon the unoffending wearer and doing him a mischief. His social existence had been more like that of an early Christian than an innocent child of the 19th century, had been stoned in the streets. He had been overthrown into gutters, bespattered with mud, violently flattened against posts. Entire strangers to his person had lifted his yellow cap off his head and cast it to the winds. His legs had not only undergone verbal criticisms and revilings, but had been handled and pinched. That very morning he had received a perfectly unsolicited black eye on his way to the grinder's establishment, and had been punished for it by the master, a superannuated old grinder of savage disposition, who had been appointed schoolmaster because he didn't know anything and wasn't fit for anything, and for whose cruel cane all chubby little boys had a perfect fascination. Thus it fell out that Byler, on his way home, sought unfrequented paths and slunk along by narrow passages and back streets to avoid his tormentors being compelled to emerge into the main road. His ill fortune brought him at last where a small party of boys headed by a ferocious young butcher were lying in wait for any means of pleasurable excitement that might happen. These, finding a charitable grinder in the midst of them, unaccountably delivered over as it were into their hands, set up a general yell and rushed upon him. But it so fell out likewise that at the same time Polly, looking hopelessly along the road before her after a good hour's walk, had said it was no use going any further, when suddenly she saw the sight. She no sooner saw it than, uttering a hasty exclamation and giving Master Dobby to the black eye, she started to the rescue of her unhappy little son. Surprises like misfortunes rarely come alone. The astonished Susan Nipper and her two young charges were rescued by the bystanders from under the very wheels of a passing carriage before they knew what had happened, and at that moment it was market day. A thundering alarm of Mad Bull was raised with a wild confusion before her of people running up and down and shouting, and wheels running over them, and boys fighting, and in Mad Bulls coming up, and the nurse in the midst of all these dangers being torn to pieces. Florence screamed and ran. She ran till she was exhausted, urging Susan to do the same, and then stopping and wringing her hands as she remembered they had left the other nurse behind, found with a sensation of terror not to be described that she was quite alone. Susan, Susan, cried Florence, clapping her hands in the very ecstasy of her alarm. Oh, where are they? Where are they? Where are they? Said an old woman coming hobbling across as fast as she could from the opposite side of the way. Why did you run away from them? I was frightened, answered Florence. I didn't know what I did. I thought they were with me. Where are they? The old woman took her by the wrist and said, I'll show you. She was a very ugly old woman with red rims round her eyes and a mouth that mumbled and chattered of itself when she was not speaking. She was miserably dressed and carried some skins over her arm. She seemed to have followed Florence for some little time, at all events, for she had lost her breath, and this made her uglier still as she stood trying to regain it, working her shriveled yellow face and throat into all sorts of contortions. Florence was afraid of her and looked hesitating up the street, of which she had almost reached the bottom. It was a solitary place, more a back road than a street, and there was no one in it but herself and the old woman. You needn't be frightened there, said the old woman, still holding her tight. Come along with me. I don't know you. What's your name? Asked Florence. Mrs. Brown, said the old woman. Good Mrs. Brown. Are they near here? Asked Florence, beginning to be led away. Susan ain't far off, said good Mrs. Brown, and the others are close to her. Is anybody hurt? Cried Florence. Not a bit of it, said good Mrs. Brown. The child shed tears of delight on hearing this and accompanied the old woman willingly, though she could not help glancing at her face as they went along, particularly at that industrious mouth, and wondering whether bad Mrs. Brown, if there was such a person, was at all like her. They had not gone far, but had gone by some very uncomfortable places, such as brickfields and tile yards, when the old woman turned down a dirty lane where the mud lay in deep black ruts in the middle of the road. She stopped before a shabby little house as closely shut up as a house that was full of cracks and crevices could be. Opening the door with a key she took out of her bonnet, she pushed the child before her into a back room where there was a great heap of rags of different colors lying on the floor, a heap of bones, and a heap of sifted dust or sanders. But there was no furniture at all, and the walls and ceiling were quite black. The child became so terrified that she was stricken speechless and looked as though about to swoon. "Now don't be a young mule," said good Mrs. Brown, reviving her with a shake. "I'm not going to hurt you. Sit upon the rags." Florence obeyed her, holding out her folded hands in mute supplication. "I'm not going to keep you even above an hour," said Mrs. Brown. "Do you understand what I say?" Child answered with great difficulty. "Yes." Then said good Mrs. Brown, taking her own seat on the bones, "Don't fix me. If you don't, I'll tell you I won't hurt you. But if you do, I'll kill you. I could have you killed at any time, even if you was in your own bed at home. Now let's know who you are, and what you are, and all about it." The old woman's threats and promises, the dread of giving her offense, and the habit unusual to her child, but almost natural to Florence now, of being quiet and repressing what she felt and feared and hoped, enabled her to do this spetting and to tell her little history, or what she knew of it. Mrs. Brown listened attentively until she had finished. "So your name's Dombey, eh?" said Mrs. Brown. "I want that pretty frock, Miss Dombey," said good Mrs. Brown, "and that little bonnet and a petticoat or two, and anything else you can spare. Come take them off." Florence obeyed as fast as her trembling hands would allow, keeping all the while a frightened eye on Mrs. Brown. When she had divested herself of all the articles of apparel mentioned by that lady, Mrs. B examined them at leisure and seemed tolerably well satisfied with their quality and value. She said, running her eyes over the child's slight figure. "I don't see anything else except the shoes. I must have the shoes, Miss Tomboy." Poor little Florence took them off with equal alacrity, only too glad to have any more means of reconciliation about her. The old woman then produced some wretched substitutes from the bottom of the heap of rags, which she turned up for that purpose, together with a girl's cloak quite worn out and very old, and the crushed remains of a bonnet that had probably been picked up from some ditch or dunghill. In this dainty raiment she instructed Florence to dress herself, and as such preparations seemed a prelude to her release, the child complied with increased readiness, if possible, in hurriedly putting on the bonnet, if that may be called a bonnet, which was more like a pad to carry loads on. She caught it in her hair, which grew luxuriantly, and could not immediately disentangle it. Good Mrs. Brown whipped out a large pair of scissors and fell into an unaccountable state of excitement. "Why couldn't you let me be?" said Mrs. Brown, "when I was contented. You little fool, I beg your pardon. I don't know what I have done," panted Florence. "I couldn't help it, couldn't help it," cried Mrs. Brown. "How do you expect I can help it?" "Why, Lord," said the old woman, ruffling her curls with a furious pleasure, "anybody but me would have had him off first of all." Florence was so relieved to find that it was only her hair and not her head which Mrs. Brown coveted that she offered no resistance or entreaty, and merely raised her mild eyes towards the face of that good soul. "If I hadn't once had a gal of my own beyond seas now that was proud of her hair," said Mrs. Brown, "I'd have had every lock of it. She's far away, she's far away." Ah, Mrs. Brown's was not a melodious cry, but accompanied with a wild tossing up of her lean arms. It was full of passionate grief and thrilled to the heart of Florence, whom it frightened more than ever. It had its part perhaps in saving her curls from Mrs. Brown, after hovering about her with the scissors for some moments, like a new kind of butterfly, bade her hide them under the bonnet and let no trace of them escape. To tempt her, having accomplished this victory over herself, Mrs. Brown resumed his seat on the bones and smoked a very short black pipe, mumbling all the time, as if she were eating the stem. When the pipe was smoked out, she gave the child a rabbit skin to carry, that she might appear the more like her ordinary companion, and told her that she was now going to lead her to a public street, when she could inquire her way to her friends. But she cautioned her with threats of summary and deadly vengeance in case of disobedience, not to talk to strangers nor to repair to her own home, which may have been too near for Mrs. Brown's convenience, but to her father's office in the city also, to wait at the street corner, where she would be left until the clock struck 3. These directions Mrs. Brown enforced with assurances that there would be potent eyes and ears in her employment, cognizant of all she did, and these directions Florence promised faithfully and earnestly to observe. At length Mrs. Brown, issuing forth, conducted her changed and ragged little friend through a labyrinth of narrow streets and lanes and alleys, which emerged after a long time upon a stable yard with a gateway at the end, whence the roar of a great thoroughfare made itself audible. Pointing out this gateway and informing Florence that when the clock struck 3 she was to go to the left, Mrs. Brown after making a parting grasp at her. Hair which seemed involuntary and quite beyond her own control told her she knew what to do and bade her go, and do it remembering that she was watched with a lighter heart. But still so afraid, Florence felt herself released and tripped off to the corner. When she reached it, she looked back and saw the head of good Mrs. Brown peeping out of the low wooden passage where she had issued her parting injunctions, likewise the fist of good Mrs. Brown shaking towards her. But though she often looked back afterwards every minute, at least in her nervous recollection of the old woman, she could not see her again. Florence remained there looking at the bustle in the street, and more bewildered by it, and in the meanwhile the clocks appeared to have made up their minds never to strike 3 anymore. At last the steeples rang out 3 o'clock. There was one close by, so she couldn't be mistaken, and after often looking over her shoulder and often going a little way and as often coming back again, lest the all-powerful spies of Mrs. Brown's should take offense, she hurried off as fast as she could in her slipshod shoes, holding the rabbit skin tight in her hand. All she knew of her father's offices was that they belonged to Danby & Son, and that was a great power belonging to the city, so she could only ask the way to Danby & Sons in the city. And as she generally made inquiry of children, being afraid to ask grown people, she got very little satisfaction. Indeed, but by dint of asking her way to the city after a while, and dropping the rest of her inquiry for the present, she really did advance by slow degrees towards the heart of that great region, which is governed by the terrible Lord Mayor, tired of walking, repulsed and pushed about, stunned by the noise and confusion, anxious for her brother, and the nurses terrified by what she had undergone, and the prospect of encountering her angry father in such an altered state, perplexed and frightened alike by what had passed, and what was passing, and what was yet before her. Florence went upon her weary way with tearful eyes, and once or twice could not help stopping to ease her bursting heart by crying bitterly. But few people noticed her at those times in the garb she wore, or if they did, believed that she was tutted to excite compassion, and passed on Florence to call to her aid all the firmness and self-reliance of a character that her sad experience had prematurely formed and tried, and keeping the end she had in view steadily before her, steadily pursued it. It was full 2 hours later in the afternoon than when she had started on this strange adventure, when, escaping from the clash and clang of a narrow street full of carts and wagons, she peeped into a kind of wharf or landing place upon the river side, where there were a great many packages, casks and boxes strewn about, a large bed of wooden scales, and a little wooden house on wheels outside of which, looking at the neighboring masts and boats, a stout man stood whistling with his pen behind his ear and his hands in his pockets, as if his day's work were nearly done. Nodding, said this man, happening to turn round, "We haven't got anything for you, little gold bilf, if you please." "Is this the city?" asked the trembling daughter of the Dombys. "Ah, it's the city, you know that well enough. I dare say, be off, we haven't got anything for you." "I don't want anything, thank you," was the timid answer, "except to know the way to Dunban's Sons." The man, who had been strolling carelessly towards her, seemed surprised by this reply, and looking attentively in her face, rejoined, "Why, what can you want with Dunban's Sons? To know the way there, if you please." The man looked at her yet more curiously, and rubbed the back of his head so hard in his wonderment that he knocked his own hat off. "Joe," he called to another man, a laborer, as he picked it up and put it on again. "Joe, it is said, Joe, where's that young spark of Dombey's, who's been watching the shipment of them goods just gone by t'other gate?" said Joe. "Call him back a minute." Joe ran up an archway bawling as he went, and very soon returned with a blithe-looking boy. "You're Dombey's Chucky, ain't you?" said the first man. "I'm in Dombey's house, Mr. Clark," returned the boy. "Look here, then," said Mr. Clark, obedient to the indication of Mr. Clark's hand. The boy approached towards Florence, wondering as well he might what he had to do with her, but she, who had heard what passed, and who, besides the relief of so suddenly considering herself safe at her journey's end, felt reassured beyond all measure by his lively youthful face and manner, ran eagerly up to him, leaving one of the slipshod shoes upon the ground, and caught his hand in both of hers. "I am lost, if you please," said Florence. "Lost?" cried the boy. "Yes, I was lost this morning a long way from here, and I've had my clothes taken away since, and I'm not dressed in my own now. And my name is Florence Domboy, my little brother's only sister, And oh dear, dear, take care of me, if you please, sobbed Florence, giving full vent to the childish feelings she had so long suppressed and bursting into tears, at the same time her miserable bonnet falling off her hair came tumbling down about her face, moving to speechless admiration and commiseration. Young Walter, nephew of Solomon Gill's ship's instrument maker and general, Mr. Clark, stood wrapped in amazement, observing under his breath, "I never saw such a start on this wharf." Before Walter picked up the shoe and put it on the little foot as the prince in the story might have fitted Cinderella's slipper on, he hung the rabbit skin over his left arm, gave the right to Florence, and felt, not to say like Richard Whittington, that is a tame comparison, but like St. George of England with the dragon lying dead before him. "Don't cry, Miss Dobby," said Walter in a transport of enthusiasm. "What a wonderful thing for me that I am here. You are as safe now as if you were guarded by a whole boat's crew of picked men from a man of war." "Oh, don't cry, I won't cry anymore," said Florence. "I'm only crying for joy, thought Walter, and I'm the cause of it. Come along, Miss Dumby. There's the other shoe off. Now take mine, Miss Dumby." "No, no, no," said Florence, checking him in the act of impulsively pulling off his own. "These do better, these do very well." "Why, to be sure," said Walter, glancing at her foot. "Mine are a mile too large. What am I thinking about? You never could walk in mine. Come along, Miss Dombey, let me see the villain who will dare molest you now." So Walter, looking immensely fierce, led off Florence, looking very happy, and they went arm in arm along the streets, perfectly indifferent to any astonishment that their appearance might or did excite. By the way, it was growing dark and foggy, and beginning to rain too, but they cared nothing for this, being both wholly absorbed in the late adventures of Florence, which she related with the innocent good faith and confidence of her years, while Walter listened as if far from the mud and grease of Thames Street. They were rambling alone among the broad leaves and tall trees of some desert island in the tropics, as he very likely fancied for the time. "They were have we far to go?" asked Florence at last, lifting up her eyes to her companion's face. "Ah, by the by," said Walter, stopping, "let me see, where are we? Oh, I know, but the offices are shut up. Now, Miss Dumby, there's nobody there. Mr. Dumby has gone home long ago. I suppose we must go home too, or stay him. Suppose I take you to my uncle's where I live, it's very near here, and go to your house in a coach to tell them you are safe, and bring you back some clothes. Won't that be best?" "I think so," answered Florence. "Don't you? What do you think?" As they stood deliberating in the street, a man passed them who glanced quickly at Walter as he went by, as if he recognized him, but seeming to correct that first impression, he passed on without stopping. "Why, I think it's Mr. Carr," said Walter. "Carr in our house?" "Not Carr, our manager, Miss Dombey, the other Carr, the junior." "Hello, Mr. Carr. Is that Walter Gay?" said the other, stopping and returning. "I couldn't believe it," with such a strange companion. As he stood near a lamp listening with surprise to Walter's hurried explanation, he presented a remarkable contrast to the two youthful figures, arm in arm before him. He was not old, but his hair was white, his body was bent or bowed as if by the weight of some great trouble, and there were deep lines in his worn and melancholy face. The fire of his eyes, the expression of his features, the very voice in which he spoke were all subdued and quenched, as if the spirit within him lay in ashes. He was respectably, though very plainly, dressed in black, but his clothes, molded to the general character of his figure, seemed to shrink and abase themselves upon him, and to join in the sorrowful solicitation which the whole man from head to foot expressed, to be left unnoticed and alone in his humility. And yet his interest in youth and hopefulness was not extinguished with the other embers of his soul, for he watched the boy's earnest countenance as he spoke with unusual sympathy, though with an inexplicable show of trouble and compassion which escaped into his looks, however hard he strove to hold it prisoner. When Walter in conclusion put to him the question he had put to Florence, he still stood glancing at him with the same expression, as if he had read some fate upon his face mournfully at variance with its present brightness. "What do you advise, Mr. Carker?" said Walter, smiling. "You always give me good advice, you know, when you do speak to me. That's not often, though. I think your own idea is the best," he answered, looking from Florence to Walter and back again. "Mr. Carr," said Walter, brightening with a generous thought, "come, here's a chance for you. Go you to Mr. Dombey's and be the messenger of good news. It may do you some good, sir. I'll remain at home. You shall go," I returned. The other, "Yes, why not, Mr. Carrara," said the boy. He merely shook him by the hand in answer. He seemed in a manner Ashamed and afraid even to do that, and bidding him good night and advising him to make haste, turned away. Come, Miss Tomboy, said Walter, looking after him as they turned away. Also, we'll go to my uncle's as quick as we can. Did you ever hear, Mr. Tomboy speak of Mr. Carker the Junior, Miss Florence? No, returned the child mildly. I don't often hear Papa speak. Ah, true, more shame for him, thought Walter, after a minute's pause during which he had been looking down upon the gentle, patient little face. Moving on at his side, he said, the strangest man, Mr. Carker the Jr., is Miss Florence, that you ever heard of. If you could understand what an extraordinary interest he takes in me, and yet how he shuns me, and avoids me, and what a low place he holds in our office, and how he is never advanced and never complains, though year after year he sees young men passed over his head. And though his brother, younger than he is our head manager, you'd be as much puzzled about him as I am, as Florence could hardly be expected to understand much about it. Walter disturbed himself with his accustomed boyish animation and restlessness to change the subject, and one of the unfortunate Jews, coming off again, opportunely proposed to carry Florence to his uncle's in his arms. Florence, though very tired, laughingly declined the proposal lest he should let her fall. And as they were already near the wooden midshipman, and as Walter went on to cite various precedents from shipwrecks and other moving accidents, where younger boys than he had triumphantly rescued and carried off older girls than Florence, they were still in full conversation about it when they arrived at the instrument maker's door. Hello, Uncle Saul, cried Walter, bursting into the shop and speaking incoherently and out of breath from that time forth for the rest of the evening. Here's a wonderful adventure. Here's Mr. Dombrey's daughter lost in the streets and robbed of her clothes by an old witch of a woman, found by me, brought home to our parlor to rest. Look here, good heavens, said Uncle Saul, starting back against his favorite compass case. It can't be well, I know, nor anybody else, said Walter, anticipating the rest. Nobody would. Nobody. Could you? No, here, just help me lift the little sofa near the fire, will you, Uncle Saul? Take care of the plates. Cut some dinner for her, will you, Uncle? Throw those shoes under the grate, Miss Florence. Put your feet on the fender to dry. How damp they are. Here's an adventure, Uncle. God bless my soul, how hot I am. Solomon Gills was quite as hot by sympathy and in excessive bewilderment. He patted Florence's head, pressed her to eat, pressed her to drink, rubbed the soles of her feet with his pocket handkerchief, heated at the fire, followed his locomotive nephew with his eyes and ears, and had no clear perception of anything except that he was being constantly knocked against and tumbled over by that excited young gentleman as he darted about the room, attempting to accomplish 20 things at once and doing nothing at all. Here, wait a minute, Uncle, he continued, catching up a candle, till I run upstairs and get another jacket on, and then I'll be off. I say, Uncle, isn't this an adventure, my dear boy, said Solomon, who, with his spectacles on his forehead and the great chronometer in his pocket, was incessantly oscillating between Florence on the sofa and his nephew and all parts of the parlor. It's the most extraordinary